Jacob is magnificent. I always enjoy a chance to speak with him. His channel SENSESPACE is beautiful. I've learned a lot from it. Even just that recent conversation that he had was just beautiful and captivating, where just discussing sort of the ability to step into situations and face the energy of those fields, and to not be afraid of that energy, and actually to see that as a necessary pre-step to enter into a space where you can really have something emerge that otherwise could not emerge. Something beautiful, something true, something good. I think every single conversation you find on SenSpace has that ability that if you actually took it to heart and you lived it, it would transform you. And it's not easy to find a channel where you can do that. Very often, it feels like when you listen to videos on channels, it's just information. It's kind of neat. You've collected some new facts and you can go from there. And it's very easy to go through life just collecting information. But to find a channel where you're actually collecting something that is alive, truth, absolute, transformative, that's not common. So I am grateful for SenSpace, and I'm grateful for you, Jacob. So thank you for being here, sir.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I'm touched by your introduction and your recognition and insight into what it is I'm kind of striving to do in conversation, recorded on SenSpace or unrecorded, or really wherever I show up, is to kind of get that space of like aliveness where it's like we're not kind of talking about the thing. It's like the thing is happening between us. It's really going on. And this idea, you know, the notion of dialectic into Dialogos, we've already talked about a little. It's been, you know, on my heart for many years. It's probably, you know, part of why you and I even encountered one another. It's what catalyzed me to get out there and have these conversations with so many people. So I'm really excited to dive in today. I have a lot of thoughts about fields and about the ways that we conduct conversation, the distinctions between discussion, debate, and the kind of conditions that give rise to dialogos, which I feel is, you know, very pertinent. And there were a number of things you touched on prior to talking about that I'm excited to get into as well. I'm really interested to also look at the vertical sort of component of this. So we think of dialogos as, in some sense, happening in the horizontal field between us. But with that, there's also a kind of ontological verticality. There's a verticality of states of being that we can be in. You could say sort of depths and height. I've recently been dipping into some Gurdjieffian models kind of soul. And it's the idea of like immanent realms of different densities, and that there's kind of this low level, really thick density to matter and to experience and to people's experience of experience. And then there are kind of various higher levels. There's moving up to the imaginal realm, to the kingdom of heaven. There's kind of a Christ realm, and so on. And so this is also kind of at play, and something that I'm not just reading about, but kind of experiencing in my day-to-day. Like I'm really contending with, you know, experiencing expansion in my soul, vertically, spatially upward, and then right back into density, right back into like engagement. And I think that kind of draws to the third thing I'm hoping we might touch on today, which was the initial kind of idea and theme for today's dialogue, was about this kind of sublation of violence, sublation of passion. How do you kind of integrate the monstrousness in such a way that actually is in service of soul and enables you to move in the world with more tenacity and intensity and vigor. And yeah, I've been having little glimpses of that with working on rap. Rap has been a big channel of that for me as well. So I'm happy to talk about that.
Beautiful.
But with that, I give it over to you and wherever you want to go with it.
Well, that's beautiful. You know, there's a few things that come to mind. You know, Lacan has this notion that the subconscious kind of structured by like a language. And Lacan also talks a whole lot about discourse and the discourse of the big other. And there's this really idea in Lacan and psychoanalysis in general that language matters and the possibility of languages matter. And what language does and how you do language directly formulates how you think about the world, how you conceptualize yourself as a subject, and how you engage with other people. What's very interesting when you're talking about like dialectic dialogos is the suggestion of the realization of a possibility of language that does not seem like it was so readily known throughout human history. Now, I'm not saying it was never known. We see, you mentioned raps, the cipher, the freestyle cipher is exactly an example of dialogos in a certain context, in a certain form, right? Dialogos being the ability of gathering people together, you don't know what's going to be said, and then something is said as if it had to have been that, right? And then when it emerges, and then it's this spiraling effect where it gets greater and greater, right? So the hip hop cipher is a powerful example of that. I think when you go back in ancient religions, you also see various rituals, you can say Pentecostalism, you see movements where there's this sense of the ability to make something emerge and happen that otherwise can't happen except in a certain condition where different people somehow kind of act as if they're singular and yet aren't, and yet not reducible, and they emerge, all these weird things, right? Alex Ebert also will talk about how at rock concerts, they'll like raise the temperature of the concert, which makes people sweat, but then that creates an electricity that makes them all like a unit, actually. Like you can do things, like there's no direct forcing people, but then they move and think together, right? So like in the music industry, there are different things. So all of these are glimmers of some ability to engage in language that has not been so readily known. And if Lacan is correct, that language structures the subconscious, then perhaps it is possible by exploring new ways of language that we will also structure the subconscious and the subject differently, which in turn would perhaps lead to a different society, right? It is hard for me. I do think Lacan's focus in a lot of religions, Christianity, in the beginning is the word, and the word is, with God and was God, logos, language, truth, beauty, all these things are tied to this mysterious thing called language. Well, if Lacan is correct that language is so fundamental, then basically it's hard to imagine any sort of new society, new world addressed to the meta crisis that doesn't unlock something new in language, because that would be the training ground of the new kind of subjectivity. And if all of these address to the metamodernism and all these different things ultimately require some sort of new subjectivity. Some people talk about integral theory, some people talk about spiral dynamics. All of those are different theories, and all of them have points. What's interesting to me is what I like so much about your work and the thinking that you do that focuses on this mysterious thing that is dialogue that always brings with it a sense of a field. You use that language. Like when you speak with someone, you almost like a field almost is there instantaneously. You may not be sensitive to it. You may not feel it, but it kind of appears, right? It's almost like language creates fields, right? So the more that we are practicing in that, what if that generates a subject that is more able to identify itself as a field as opposed to a thing, right? Because that's what we tend to do, right? We tend to think of language makes words that mean a thing. But what if language is a perpetual field generation that creates in the act of speaking, just like God in Genesis, right? And what's so interesting to that, if we take this psychoanalytical focus on discourse and language, and I know discourse is not just language, it means the whole zeitgeist and all these different stuff, but all of that is communicated through information, right? And language and words, and so it's really important. What kind of new subject would that open up? I think, and then I'll pass it back to you, it's also very interesting to me that this has emerged under pluralism and globalization, because the precondition for these kind of conversations seems to be diversity, like different kinds of people from different backgrounds who have different ways of doing things. In the past, as I was telling you before, it tended to be in economics, like Silk Roads and trade, where really radically different people would interact regularly. Of course, if you lived in America, the Chinese would run into the Americans in like New York or whatever. But then look, everyone had Chinatown, Italiantown, people more self-segregated, right? Self-segregation is natural for humans to do, for good and for bad. There's good to it and there's bad to it, right? Well, economics would often force people to interact if they were going to do the trade agreement, right? So that occurred. But what's happening today is because of the internet, people that are very different are running into each other and then finding themselves having to react, which can lead to pathology and all the conspiracies and all the problems. But then another thing it could do is open up this entire world of dialogos this entire world of the emergence, the entire world of all these kind of new things that are being discovered, cipher, circling, et cetera, so forth, right? Which before may not have occurred, not because it was impossible, but simply because there was not the information technology to have a regular encounter of diversity. And then with that diversity, finding enough people within them who had the emotional attunement to not be thrown off by that diversity. Because if you bring different people together, but you don't have people in there, I guess Bard will talk about like shaman or whatever, right? To kind of move between that diversity, then it's just going to be a fight, right? So what you have is like this gathering of diverse people who also are navigating that diverse space that then unveils this emergent possibility that may suggest the possibility of a restructuring, according to Lacan, the subconscious and the subject. And to me, why I appreciate the work that you do in this whole topic is because if we're going to be talking about game B, addressing the meta crisis, all of those different things, then this question of language is at ground zero because it's the question of the subject. And in my opinion, you can make the most perfect economic model on planet Earth that is not going to destroy the environment. But if you don't have human beings that want to do it or who care to do it or have the emotional attunement to value it, it's not going to matter. Models that don't address the subject may indeed be better models than what you currently have. And in fact, may even work if people did them, but they just won't do them. Or they won't care, or they'll rebel and go back to their game A or whatever, right? So the work and cultivation of the subject must go with model creation. I'm not saying model creation doesn't matter. It's always both. It's always you got to do the whole game, right? You got to do the work on the subject. You got to do the work on the model. You got to do economics. You got to do sexuality. You got to do family. You got to do science. You got to do everything. Well, right now, if you got to do everything, that means you have to do a lot of talking, right? So you better be good at talking and it not be rivalry dynamic. So I think that focus that you're bringing to the floor is just so important.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel, and really, really pertinent points to pick up on. And how you rounded that off was just like, oh, exactly what I was going for. So I think this, when you're using the word subject, for me, what's coming is basically the consciousness, the quality of the consciousness of the individuals involved. If you change the systems, if you change the models, if you introduce recycling, what have you, that doesn't necessarily shift the underlying sense of being in which one considers themselves separate from the materials with which they are recycling. And when you scale that up and spread it around, it just doesn't work. And that's basically where we are, is we can't solve the problem through shifting the models sufficiently. And there is this interesting sense of like, well, how the fuck are we going to do this? Like, if you look at it as an empirical challenge with a fixed landscape of consciousness, we're fucked. But we're not in a fixed landscape of consciousness. We're in a landscape with all kinds of topography in it. And dialogue is this kind of, we can think of it as like a horizontal plane that cuts through all of those different domains of life. Right. And so whilst what you and I are perhaps orienting to is how to cultivate this in the context of online communities and spaces of intentional dialogue, the reality of fields and your participation in them and the underlying energetics is something that's happening in every single interaction anywhere. And some people would say, you know, even non-locally is happening. But that's another story. There's also this question of, as you kind of, some people would suggest that actually this is an evolutionary process that's occurring. Elizabeth Debold and Thomas Steininger, who do emergent dialogue, I believe they see it as an evolutionary process. They and I have both been very informed by people like Teilhard de Chardin, who puts forward a beautiful, powerful work, a series of works, synthesizing science and religion in an evolutionary fashion. And this guy's mind is just unbelievable. Understanding of geology, understanding of celestial bodies, understanding of theology, so on. there's a notion that it's something about the particular moment of connectedness. Desjardins almost talks about it as like the closing of the circuit. Like there's this, there's these human tribes, these civilizations, and they're spreading and growing industriously, and we're on this exponential curve that's happening. And with that, there's also a field of consciousness, a field of mind being nous, noosphere. There's a noosphere that's emerging with these cultures. And now we're at this moment where the circuit closes and the entire earth begins to be kind of enveloped in that noosphere, and the internet kind of accelerates and expresses that that's happening.
Right.
That's a lot of kind of the, how would we put it? That's kind of the artful understanding of how this is occurring at a larger scale. But I want to kind of stick it back with the fields for now, because I think there's a hell of a lot there. And I think that the word shaman is written all over everything that you've been spoken to for me. I consider this work to be a kind of shamanism, whether you want to call it metamodern shamanism, digital shamanism, dialogical shamanism. We're working in a space between minds. We're working in a space in which we are presencing the mystery and coming into relationship to it. And that's probably the deepest point of orientation for the subject, for the consciousness in a shared field. However, that is a kind of sensitive thing to be channeled into. It's not easy for us to necessarily transition from day-to-day consciousness into that state of awareness. And that really is a going beyond the subject. It's getting to a place for me where I'm listening, where I'm participating, where I'm fully here, and then I'm able to, in a certain sense, become empty in my listening and give my listening to the person who is with me, such that my attention, my consciousness conforms to them. In a certain sense, I'm becoming them to a degree. I'm being with them. I'm knowing them in the kind of biblical sense of knowing. And then with this Dialogos, there's kind of a movement back and forth. There's a tantra to it, basically. There's a movement between self and other, and self and other. And to the extent that we can get this thing working smoothly, and there may be niches along the way and obstacles, and those are actually, super useful learning opportunities. Those are not to be avoided. As we undergo that back and forth movement, my selfhood is here, my selfhood is here, my selfhood is here, my selfhood is here. It's almost like you can see like the field is being spun up through the movement of that, like the field is being generated through the movement of that. And that field does have a wisdom to it. It might even have an evolutionary function. But in any case, I'm somebody who's dialoguing with lots of philosophers, lots of people who are much better read than me. And my capacity to do that meaningfully, as well as to shamanistically be of service to somebody in dialogue, to help bring about a space where insight can emerge, or a space where some sort of healing and integration can occur. It's ultimately not about me. And it's about me becoming a space and participating in such a way that I can conform with the other person. And this is another matter of language. Like you're going to come in with a certain language, a certain world. I have to be a shapeshifter,
right,
to be best equipped to conform to you. And that's shamanistic to me. And it doesn't have to be super fancy. It's like, if you're talking to a person from a particular background or style or whatever, you meet them where they are and you begin that. There's no point trying to talk about, a bunch of ideas or concepts that someone has no relation to. So you work with the container of consciousness or the field that the other person brings, and you conform yourself with that. You enter into a relationship, you enter inside of it, and then you begin to move inside of it. And even within the bounds of that, you can still be energetically working. You can be creating a space of openness within yourself. You can be sensing what's coming up. You can be orienting based on that. And I think there's an ongoing feedback loop and process between one's participation in the social fields, in the dialogue fields, and one's process outside of that. One's experiences of insight in private, one's solitude, one's healing. These things are opening up the sensory channels of the body in such a way that you can better sense the field. And the more sensing you bring, it's like you don't necessarily need to say anything at all. In fact, it might be better if you don't, because your presence is like an ontological gravity weight. It's, you know, they kind of talk about those attractors, those second attractor, third attractor, that kind of like pulls the space-time fabric of the field. Each person has the potential to do that. And so where you're kind of holding it down ontologically in your state of being, in your state of presence, is drawing the field into that.
Beautiful. It reminds me, so there's a few things. I once heard a guy say, it was interesting, he was kind of making an apologetic argument, and he kind of said, you know, if in the history of the world, there's ever been one time where someone actually experienced divinity, then divinity exists. Just once in human history, then divinity exists. And the point he's making is that millions upon millions upon millions upon millions of people in human history have claimed to have had experiences of the divine. Usually they use the word God, but some sort of experience that suggests reality is not reducible, right? That there's something more going on. Well, that would immediately mean the investigation is rational, because no, it doesn't prove divinity, but the fact that if only one of those cases actually occurred, it suddenly is now a rational undertaking, right? Because it's extremely probable that there's one case where it's real, right? So what this is doing, the argument is making theology rational, because there's always an argument, is theology even rational to do? Maybe it's all just fairy tales, right? Well, the argument there of investigating divinity, I'll use a broader term, divinity, that probability point that I just made makes taking it seriously rational, right? And then you unfold with the concept and think about it. The same applies to, say, fields, the ability, emergence, and all these things. If once in human history, individuals in conversation have experienced and actually experienced fields, whatever this mysterious thing is that is fields, but they genuinely experienced it, and they're generally correct. Like the gentleman was saying, the Leslie, he was saying that he could feel the energy of the negativity of the meeting he was going to have like a day beforehand, and then he gets there and they're all stressed out, right? There are so many people who claim empathy like that. They literally will claim that they know how somebody's feeling, and they're right. And it's mysterious. Like, how the heck do they know that, right? If one of those in all of human history is true, well, then all of that is all legitimate. Fields are real. All of that is real, which immediately means that the material world is not made of things, it's made of fields, right? And I think that is a scientific consensus. I think most people now will actually talk mostly about there being more so fields than things, relations, and so on and so forth. But we actually have not conceptually mediated that on the realm of the subject, because we still speak as if words are just words, that words are just things, that interactions are just between two individuals, not through a relation that is irreducible to both of them. What we kind of are scientifically finding, although I'm no expert on the science, has not translated yet into lived experience. And what Dialogos and all of that is doing, and I know there are different terms for different people, all of it is doing is the conceptual mediation of all of that to the subjective level, to experience, how we do business, how we do conversation, how we do relationships. If indeed the relation between two lovers is something that is not reducible to the individuals of the lovers, well, then we're in an entirely different world, right? Because basically, I think the average person still believes that in a relationship is two individuals and that's it. Whereas in truth, there's three things: the two individuals and the relations between those two individuals, right? Well, that's a very, very different schema by which to think of every single human interaction, every single community, every single economy, every single sexual ethics, every single religion, everything. And so that's what we're talking. And again, if there ever in human history been an experience, a genuine experience of a relation that is not reducible to the individuals, then relations are real. Just like Wolfgang Smith is saying, just like Vervaeke, just like I would argue Hegel, right? So this is the sphere of what does it mean to take seriously the reality that relations themselves are just as real as individuals, actually. What does that mean? Well, you do conversationally differently. You do community differently. You do identity differently. You do everything differently, actually. Because if you also think about it, basically all economics, politics, everything is systems of organizing information, right? Because what, if you think about like an economy is like an organization of information. Prices, where should the bottled water go? Where should the product go? It's constantly exchanging information, right? Politics is what does the country want? What does the country not? All of these are information sorting, information organizing systems, right? Well, what you think is information then transforms the kind of mechanisms you make in the society, right? If relations are real, then that becomes information your society must be able to organize, or it will be reductionist. Right now, we do not have economics, politics, sociological structures that can meaningfully organize relations as real, because it does not define in its data that it organizes relations as part of the data set, ergo reductionism, right? So if you have a data set where the only things allowed to be data are things, then the socioeconomic structure can only organize things, right? What we are seeing is evidence in these conversations that relations are real, and therefore the socioeconomic system must begin to organize relations, not just things. Now, if you organize relations, you get things as well. The C.S. Lewis principles of first things first, you get second things also, but if you put second things first, you lose both. I always love that from C.S. Lewis. So if you put relations in your pot, you also get things. But if you just have things, you actually lose both things and relations, because there are no such things as things. There's only field, right? So this is the challenge that's now happening. And what I would argue is that for most of human history, to go into the evolutionary structure that you were describing, societies could get away with the mistake of treating things as things because there was not the regular encounter of diversity to destabilize the things and unveil that they don't have a transcendental grounding. Like, what was the 20th century but a search for a transcendental grounding, right? Like Heidegger, philosophy, what's like an absolute grounding of being, right? Well, we found out you can't do that. Maybe you take Derrida, he said you can't do that. He makes the case. Well, that means the plausible deniability that most civilizations through most of history were able to hold themselves together, even though they had a false metaphysics of things, that time is over. Because the plausible deniability is gone, right? So you are now in an age that has to realize the metaphysical reality that was always the case, but until now you could get by not living it simply because you weren't encountering diversity so much. The true metaphysics is where relations are real, right? And now we have no choice but to integrate that into the entire socioeconomic system because of the meta crisis, the meaning crisis, the environment, all of these different things, right? And these spaces are kind of almost like laboratories that constantly provide data to give you reason to believe fields and relations are real. And if one of them are real, that proves that they're real. So it creates the more and more these conversations occur, the more and more plausible it becomes that relations are truly real, not just something you read in a scientific notebook and you read and say, oh, relations are real. That's nifty. No, you experience it. And humans are only changed by what they experience. You have to experience relations as being real to truly believe it and then start changing your society, right? And that's what these spaces can do. I can tell people all day long relations are real, and they may even entirely agree. I mean, arguably, people have been saying that since Whitehead or whatever, right? But it hasn't changed people. Why? Because people are not changed by ideas. They're changed by experiences. The internet now allows for people to experience the reality of relations and emergence. And once they experience that, they then are truly motivated to socioeconomically change the system to make part of its data set real relations. And that's when you can have real change. So you've got to come to the ground zero, as you were putting it. And a few more things. You mentioned Pierre Day. It's very interesting during Chardin. There are a number of people in his period, like Rudolf Steiner comes to mind, Owen Barfield. All of them basically suggested, they said the following: we like to say that biology evolves, right? That the body evolves and so on and so forth. Well, what if consciousness evolves too? And they all said, that's not really that crazy, because if you believe consciousness emerges from brain and brain changes biologically, then why wouldn't consciousness as well, right? Like why would you bracket out consciousness as, and what they mean by consciousness evolving, they mean the kind of qualia that consciousness can detect can evolve, right? Why is that a crazy idea? Here's an example. We know the mantis shrimp is able to see so much of the color spectrum that humans cannot. We know dolphins have echolocation. We know different animals have different biological abilities, right? Okay. So we know that different brains can have different experiences, right? So what's the problem? We know it can happen. So you'd have to argue the following. You'd have to argue that there's something about echolocation, that the wiring in the brain that allows echolocation does not also allow consciousness, right? If that's not the case, then it is completely possible that you could have a brain that has the same wiring that allows human experience that also allows echolocation, or also the wiring of a higher color spectrum, right? If that is possible, then it is evolutionarily possible through time. Do you understand what I'm saying? So it is not crazy to suggest that you could literally through time have evolutionary changes to a biological structure of the brain that would lead to different qualia experiences, right, of consciousness. And maybe the biological, because maybe the very real experience of diversity as an environment, because that's real. You experience diversity. You experience the internet, right? You experience the internet. All of this creates an environment that may, in fact, cause an evolution of the brain, or transformation of the brain, neuroplasticity and all of that, that lead to a consciousness transformation that opens it up to different qualias. And one of those qualias might be greater sensitivity to fields, greater sensitivity to relations. Precisely the world today might be an environment that helps humans evolve biologically, which changes their biological makeup and their neurological makeup, that then changes how the consciousness experiences or can experiences. And one of the things it may gain is higher sensitivity to the reality of relations. Where in the past, it was not in an environment of diversity that would develop that ability, because basically you didn't need it to survive. Everyone around you was Christian. Everyone around you was basically Hindu. You didn't need that ability to survive. Well, evolution is, we have to be careful to make it sound like evolution equals get better, right? That's a big mistake people make. But basically, evolution and survival are mixed together, right? Well, what if one of the things you need to survive diversity is the ability to sensitively detect fields, or to detect the reality of relations, right? Well, then it would make sense that evolutionarily, you would have a development that makes people more able to detect the reality of those relations. And then Dialogos would be the training ground by which to hyper-focus in that evolutionary change that's happening everywhere. But this is where you really focus on it to get a sense of what's happening everywhere in a very, very distilled form, so you can get really good at it, right? And kind of accelerate the evolutionary process, right? So to me, it's not crazy at all. Now, I'm not saying all of that is true, but I don't think it's crazy. It actually makes a lot of sense. And there were actually a lot of thinkers who had that kind of model, and we kind of left it behind, and we started to do more personality evolution. I think that's a lot, I'm not an expert on like any of that, like spiral dynamics or different things, but a little bit of let's put it this way. The emphasis started moving in the realm of personality, Enneagram, Myers-Briggs, and all of that. And personality is real. I'm not denying that. But there's actually a history of thought that wanted to say, yes, personality evolves, but it does so because of the evolution of the brain, which emerges to a consciousness that literally evolves in the qualia it detects. It's not merely like coral, whatever the color is. Like coral's good with paradox, right? That seems to be true. There seems to be a percentage of people who are good at handling difference and paradox, right? Well, what Rudolf Steiner and all those cats are talking about is not merely the ability to emotionally handle paradox, literally an evolution of consciousness that changes your qualia, literally changes how you experience the world and what you can detect on now it can't be radical, but on different degrees, right? And that makes sense because we do know also that human experience of the world changes after information technology. You go to William Ong, you go to Marshall McLuhan, after the book, after the printing press, literally the way people experience the world is different. After, the end, when people are in an oral tradition, the way they experience the world is different. And I would argue the character of their qualia was also different with information technology. So it is not hard to imagine that there could be some sort of evolution of qualia that occurs with the internet that is necessary for our survival in the midst of globalization and pluralization. And that evolution of qualia might be the very ability to be sensitive to fields and to detect as plausible the reality of relations. So to me, all of that is completely plausible.
Wonderfully put, sir. Thank you. I can feel the branching out of many possible directions, but I actually think there's a through line I'm already feeling, and I love to follow. The first thing that comes to me from some of my unpublished writings about Dialogos a few years ago was bringing together my experience of what was going on in these fields and the sense of reaching, as you were kind of speaking to at the beginning of your thread, reaching a horizon that you haven't reached before, breaking through into a state of experience that you haven't yet experienced. You're doing something new. And as you were speaking to about divinity being one quality of experience that you might reach, so too with these fields. Now, Rupert Sheldrake is a really interesting guy, scientist, philosopher, kind of been quite influential on the rewilding Christianity thing in recent years. And he also has been somebody who's explored fringe science, telepathy, and things that were completely off the books and now kind of on the books. So he came up with this idea of morphic fields. And it really substantiates precisely what you said, is that when an evolution happens somewhere in the world, it then becomes more possible for it to happen elsewhere in the world. And with that, the idea that maybe the more human beings at any given time who are accessing a particular quality of experience, that becomes more readily available. There's like a greater learnability available in the wider field of humanity. And so this is really helpful when thinking about how does something like Dialogos, or what Dialogos points to in terms of fields of relationship that are holding consciousness in such a way that allows us to slow down the problem of accelerating off the cliff and enter into a place of relative peace with where we are, and a shared cognition, a collective cognition, a shared sense making that is actually beyond the sum of the parts of each of us individually. So that's kind of, I think that's more or less well established now. Like a lot of people, anyone who was kind of on the rebel wisdom wave years ago kind of has a sense of what I'm talking about here. Another piece that isn't so much introduced, but has also been a big focus for me over the years, has been this idea of the landscape of trauma. And what I mean by that is something that is, it's not referring to an individual, it's particularly a landscape. It's how do we think of it as a kind of negativity in the philosophical sense that you refer to, or I'd say like an emotional dark matter, psychic dark matter, in a way that the past is meaningfully present and also holds frozen potential for the evolution of consciousness. And so I have a good friend who's been working with Thomas Hubel, who is kind of a leader in collective trauma healing in Israel and Germany, and he's been getting circles of people together, you know, people from German backgrounds, Jewish backgrounds, so on. They get into these Dialogos style fields, And what started happening is spontaneously, just through holding the field in that way, the past begins to presence itself. And these things begin to come through, and people are having these experiences of, an upswelling of a release of something. And often the quality of that, there's almost an analogy I would draw here. This kind of breaking through, kind of almost like a lightning bolt, like breaking up into the state of divinity, like you've broken through into a new state of consciousness. This experience of healing in a field functions very much in the same way. I think it's like a lightning bolt happening, and the ontological opening has occurred, and with the opening, insight into actually the nature of what has been integrated. And so this is it's been a really important insight for me over the years, is that we don't understand the nature of the thing we call trauma and then heal it. We heal it, and then we understand what that means. And so what does that have to do with fields, dialogos, our capacity to hold the fabric of humanity together? Well, actually, it has a whole lot, because it's probably one of the biggest constricting factors on our capacity to meaningfully participate in a field. Mm. And in the converse, when we're entering into dialogical spaces and we're not having that kind of, we could consider it kind of like a hygiene practice, just like a very, the basic kind of tips and ways of like, okay, we're entering into a field now. We've established that we're entering into a field. That would be one thing. Another would be a co-presencing of the experiential life matter of the people involved and the content of the conversation. Because otherwise what you have is we're having a debate about politics, or we're having a debate about literature or philosophy or what have you, but actually energetically, that's not in isolation. What's going on is you're having a communion of the psyches, and the sum total of the psyches of all of those people, everything that's present and activated and everything that's kind of cut off, and all those things are interacting. What's going on in my childhood with my rivalry with the kid on the school playground is happening, in a conversation about something completely different. So we can't not have that happening, but there's something about holding the space intentionally which orients us to like being aware of those levels as we're participating, and dropping us into our bodies so that we're not just kind of rolling off cognitively without awareness of those deeper levels. And ultimately what I've found, like my journey into this, is through ontological initiations. Whether by myself in relation to psychedelics and or nature, or in very particular conversations with people who had been on a whole life journey. Having a conversation with Jordan Hall on one or two occasions strike me as a really meaningful example for me of like getting into a conversation with this person was an ontological initiation. I experienced a field relationally between the two people that opened up a space of possibility of this is what it can be like to be in a space, not just of dialogue, but of consciousness, of awareness. And of course, in those spaces, there are insights and clarities that you can have, which you otherwise wouldn't have. And so it's really a wonderful way of being of service to one another as we become more skillful with these fields. And I think the last dynamic I would just point to is that, we're doing this like dual act in a way of like, there is this gathering together of individuals. There's a drawing together, and between them, these fields are generating, and this potential is perhaps being unlocked. But then there's also like an outward facing of everybody who's not participating in that. And so as your capacity to be aware, as your healing and integration journey goes on, as your awareness of fields occurs, all of that comes into the world, into your interactions with family, into your commercial interactions, and so on. In some ways, it can give you kind of Jedi mind tricks and abilities to like manifest things that wouldn't happen. But ultimately, you're just experiencing what's happening in the world more deeply.
Beautifully put, my friend. There's a few things. AI is going to read more books than all of us. And so these skills of fields is the distinguishing factor. It is doubtful that AI will have these field skills, if you will, these Jedi abilities you were mentioning, right? As AI proves that no human being can read as many books as AI or analytically reason as well as AI, then the, if you will, unique ability that humans will have will precisely become clearer and clearer. A lot of the stuff that we are describing that for most of history has been woo-woo, right? Has been weird and woo-woo. Well, it turns out that it's almost like a lot of the talk on like remote viewing was another one, these kind of ideas of these weird things that the mind can do. It's almost like when it came early, or when it showed up in history, it's kind of early in a way. But now with AI, it's like time, because that's the only differentiating principle you've got. Otherwise, AI replaces humanity, right? And so there's a way in which the very terror of AI replacing humanity could possibly be the forcing function that makes humans take all the woo-woo stuff not as woo-woo, look at it seriously. And then the only way to see that woo-woo stuff is not woo-woo is to look at it seriously. But there's never been a forcing function to make us look at it seriously as a collective. And that will possibly occur because of AI. And how funny would it be then if there's some kind of subconscious way now, that where AI is created precisely to be the forcing function, because no other thing would force us to look into these things other than AI. Because if you think about it, like a natural disaster wouldn't, right? It has to be something that can literally replace human intellect as we think of human intellect, right? The only thing that could do that is artificial intelligence. If you have like a meteor hit the ocean, that would just be interpreted as meaning, oh, we need to be more rational to figure out how to stop meteors from hitting the ocean, right? So you become more like AI. In order for the human being to be forced to take seriously other psychic abilities or psychological abilities, it's hard to know the right word there. In order to get humans to take those abilities seriously, basically the only option is AI, right? And then you kind of wonder, oh, does that mean history like intentionally produces AI to be the forcing function? And is there some collective consciousness stuff? That's where you get into a lot of mysteries that AI is going to force us to take seriously, because that will be the only differentiating principle left, right? It's that's, Dialogos and all these different things we're describing. So it's funny to think of AI as the forcing function to take seriously all of this stuff that otherwise is woo-woo. You mentioned in that movie, Waking Life, I suppose, it struck me when I saw it maybe 20 years ago, talking about how if you give people a crossword puzzle, like 10% of people finish it. But if you gave that same crossword puzzle to a different city in a different area 2 weeks later, it goes up to like 40%. As if the very doing of the crossword puzzle somewhere in the world increases the likelihood that unrelated people somewhere can do the crossword puzzle. I have never seen if this experiment has been reproduced, but it's always stuck with me. And it does seem, actually, and I can't prove this. This is just something I've noticed. It does seem that when someone comes up with a new idea online, suddenly unrelated people elsewhere come up with that idea as well, or something very similar to it. Are they stealing from that person? I don't think so, because often it's too languaged in their own structure. It doesn't seem like they stole. Like in order to steal an idea, you can't have your whole structure, your own original structure around it for that idea, right? So the very fact that all of these different groups have their own structures around those ideas that are repeating is evidence it is not stolen, but that it is emergent within their own symbolic, okay? So I think you actually see that crossword puzzle occurring, right? Which would then suggest that there is something to this idea that consciousness has some collective function, which of course is almost necessary if relations are real. Like if relations are real, then all consciousness is really relating, right? Now, it's not reducible. You can't reduce an individual consciousness to the collective, as you can't reduce the collective to the individual. But there's some dynamic at play there that is very, very strange. But of course, if we go in every single religious tradition, when they talk about prayer, it basically is suggesting that if you are to train your mind in a certain way, it can have an effect on events that are unrelated to you in a kind of woo-woo way, right? Like prayer throughout history is very hard to distinguish from magical spells sometimes, and yet it's not reducible to magical spells. But there's really this idea that if you pray for someone, it's not guaranteed, but it has some sort of influence. Maybe. Where did this mythology come from, right? It's interesting that it exists. Where does the remote viewing stuff come from? It's interesting that it exists. Maybe it's all insane, but again, it's worth taking seriously because it's basically the only thing we got left with AI. We ought to take it seriously because otherwise AI got the competitive advantage, right? We need to have a monopoly that's something that human consciousness can do that AI cannot do at this point, and really, really own that, because otherwise we're just going to feel like we should all be replaced by AI, right? So we should take it seriously. And again, if there's one example in human history where this stuff is real, then it's real, right? There just has to be one, right? Like we're saying with God, if there's ever been one true experience of God, then God exists, right? And millions of people claim it, therefore it's rational to take seriously. Likewise, all this near-death experiences is another one, right? There's reason to take it seriously. Maybe it is false, but it is not irrational to consider. That's where people conflate. They conflate false with irrational to consider. That's not the case. There can be plenty of false things that are rational to consider given the probability of the consideration, right? And in these cases, it's rational to consider them given the amount of genuine attestments to them, right? You know, another example is it is rational to consider religion, especially because there are so many martyrs. Literally, people believed it so much that they're willing to die for it. Now, that could just be Waco, Texas. They could just be crazy, right? But a martyr, it's not easy to dismiss a martyr, right? You really got to listen to them, right? And so likewise, you literally have people whose entire lives are ruined when they claim that they had psychedelic experiences of various types. So they pay a high price for it and they genuinely believe it. So you have to take it seriously. And again, if fields exist, which seem to exist when you have a conversation with people, then all this other stuff gains more credibility, and then more credibility, and then more credibility. And basically what it all suggests is that when we talk about consciousness, we're not talking about consciousness as we understand it. We're talking about something else. It's like we've been talking with Ebert. Like if limits are precisely what create, following freak theory, then the word limit does not mean what we think it means. It means something deeper, right? Likewise, the word consciousness probably doesn't mean what we think it means, right? Now, you mentioned also there's probably something more going on, of which we would have reason to consider given what occurs in Dialogos. There's a field effect, right? Okay, so consciousness is not a thing. It's some sort of organizing principle of fields. What does that mean? Well, that's we're working on that. But the very consideration of that is there. The other thing that's important with it is a lot of people hear all of this and may immediately kind of go, well, it sounds like magic. You're talking about kind of magic or something like that. It sounds like I can just will to have remote viewing, or I can just will to have a conscious psychedelic experience, and so on and so forth. What's very, very important is in all of the people who talk about this stuff, it's conditional. It is not just something you can have. There's a certain physical conditioning to have the experience, right? Take a near-death experience. What do you have to do to have a near-death experience? You have to have your brain shut down. So there's a certain biological condition that is necessary for the near-death experience, right? Well, likewise, a lot of the people, like when the CIA did this whole remote viewing stuff, there was training that had to be done to be capable to do remote viewing, right? Well, what does this mean? This means matter and notion are in a relation with one another. Physical and metaphysical are in a relation with one another. The problem is, most of the time when people hear this topic, they think what you're saying is that metaphysics is more powerful than physics, or that the physical is not real or whatever. No, no, no. You are not capable of doing a dialogos unless you gain the physical reality of people in conversation. Something has to occur in the physical world, per se, of people coming together to talk, right? So you can't just summon dialogos like a magic trick, but that's what people think you're saying. Well, wait a minute. If all of these quote unquote woo-woo abilities require certain physical conditioning, then you're saying that the physical world is real. And that is what conditions the emergence that comes out in these special cases that suggests the potential for these emergences in the physical world, right? So this is not dualist. This is not like one over the other. You have to condition the physical world in such a way to give rise to these phenomena. You cannot get a world where people get 40% of the crossword puzzle right unless you first give it to people where only 10% of people get it, right? So there's a condition that has to be met to make the next psychological reality possible. You understand what I'm saying? Religions, what we are describing basically, and all of that would be nature and notion, like in Hegel. Nature informs notion, notion informs nature. It's not notion separate from nature or nature separate from notion. It's nature and notion going together, right? Okay? So likewise, it's not so crazy though, because if literally your brain, being of a certain physical conditioning, emerges to consciousness, what if the entire world is just like that? Where if you condition certain things in the world in a certain way, it emerges to kind of weird, bizarre phenomenon that are very real, not epiphenomena. That's ridiculous. They're very, very real in the same way that consciousness is very, very real if you arrange a brain correctly. If your brain gets shot through, it doesn't produce consciousness anymore, right? Because you do not meet the physical condition anymore to emerge to consciousness, right? So what if all of physical reality is like that in different ways, right? But it's not magic because you have to meet the condition. The real material world has power over you. You cannot just will dialogos from out of nothing. You have to meet the world. The problem is people hear this stuff and they think you're talking about magic over the world. We're talking a magic in the world, magic with the world, if you want to use the magic language, right? And so you have to take the real world as real as the precondition for all this other stuff we're talking about. And that's where the conversation now needs to go. Because too much people hear about this stuff, like with the crossword puzzle and all these different things, and they think you're saying that the material world is an illusion or whatever. No, the material world is necessary, or otherwise there would not be the conditions of which make possible the metaphysical. There is no metaphysical without the physical, because the physical are the conditions that make possible the metaphysical, right? And the metaphysical would be a world of fields. The metaphysical would be a world of real relations. And of course, the metaphysical in that sense means meta is always in parentheses. It's always meta parentheses physical, not just physical, metaphysical without parentheses. You're always dealing with metaphysical with the meta in physical, meaning that the physical can reference itself in it, because meta means self-reference in this sense, it means different things, but the physical can reference itself by itself, and in that act change its conditioning and what it is, which then changes the possibilities of it. And basically that's what we're seeing humans are capable of doing in Dialogos. You're capable of referencing conversation and one another in such a manner that changes what you are capable of emerging and producing live in the act. That's what you're doing. You are engaging in a reference back and forth in conversation that is changing your constitution and changing what you're capable of thinking and capable of the energies you're capable of entering into and experiencing live. So a dialogos could be an extreme concentration of the metaphysical reality, meta in parentheses, that the entire world is actually capable of if met on the right conditions. But then again, we don't know what those conditions are so easily because it's not self-evident. So we have to have a lot of experimentation, a lot of trying. And if AI is going to replace rationality, that's the kind of experimentation we need to do. Metaphysical experiments, metaphysical tests with the meta in parentheses, because AI is going to take care of all the rational, reading all the books or whatever. But the things that humans could do that AI could not do is experiments to figure out the metaphysical, the conditioning of which makes possible the emergence of the metaphysical. And that would be a role for humans to have. That would not make them reducible to something that AI does not need. we would be able to have a role in the world of which would still matter very much.
Well, I flip and love this because it's very pertinent to my grounded considerations of how am I approaching the future. And, this is something you've been really meaningfully addressing in a dialogue with Tom and in the net and so on, is this question of how are we going to relate to this AI horizon, AI singularity, and what should we be prioritizing? And it's a question for all of us to ask, right? And so I'm engaging in that right now. I have worked for income that is kind of like, yeah, it's probably going to be an AI job. And then I have, what am I devoting with the rest of my time to and around that? And so it's a really meaningful question. What you've spoken to about this question of dualism and where does the metaphysical realm live, right? To me, the way that I'm viewing it is that we are the bridge. Our bodies are a kind of bridge between realms, we could say, lower realms, higher realms, and we have the capacity to move between those. The ancients had kind of heaven and hell, kingdom of heaven, hell. We know that we can create hell on earth. We've done it many times. There are different levels with which we can participate in reality. That is to be sure. And what came for me in what you were saying was, and it felt like a real flash of insight, was that we're undergoing a migration. And Brett Weinstein, the evolutionary biologist, has talked about this. This is part of what it means to be human in the evolutionary story, is this kind of valley crossing, this movement from one place where it's like, okay, things are working out, it's all good, we're going to stay here. And then there's a sense, there's an intuition of we need to go somewhere else. And that's kind of a non-rational, trans-rational, whatever you call that.
Sure.
There's an intuition of a movement. And that's what we're undergoing. And yeah, as you spoke to, all the frontiers are closed. The net of the noosphere, the net of diversity, the world has come so close around that there's no we're not going to go on a migration to a physical frontier. So what does that mean? It means that we're on a migration to a new frontier of consciousness, a new way of relating to what is. And perhaps first and foremost, we do have to see that what is isn't all there is, and it's possible for our experience to radically shift. I have experienced this in my own life. I used to be a debating man. I believe you were a debating man too at university. I love to talk about politics and have these kinds of conversations. And I had them with all kinds of different people, talked to Jews and Muslims and left and right and everything. But I had them always from kind of above my shoulders. I had them from a very rational, heady place. I didn't really experience my own emotions or the emotional field, and I was cut off from those parts of my body. Subsequent years of university, I had openings of different channels of my body. What does that mean? It means I had a really big crying session about something, and on the other side of that, I was now opened. I was sensitive to a layer of reality that I was not before. Started with my chest area, later on my kind of gut area opened, and we have a lot of science now to know that the gut is very central to cognition. Yeah. And so we can imagine, those are very big openings, but we can imagine maybe there's more and more subtle layers to this. And the brain isn't really like a machine or a mechanical object. It's kind of fractal and holographic, and the degree of fractal interconnection within the brain that is possible, we don't really know. And that brain is not just, the mind is not just in the brain, it's in the whole body. So if there is a possibility of more interconnectedness within the whole of the human system, then how much awareness is possible could increase. And as you say, this isn't monkey science. This is just the story of monkeys to men, right? Some of the monkeys had this breaking through into what Teilhard de Chardin calls reflection, reflective consciousness. What was that thing that went from we're just in it, we're eating, we're in the jungle, what have you, in the plains of Africa, and through some process, through some teleological pull, whether you believe it was eating the mushrooms, whether you believe the universe itself has a teleology, a pull, a direction towards more complexity, consciousness broke through into this place where imagination became possible, where the realm of language, which is what is language, exaptation of something that was already there. We had the tongue tasting poisons, what have you, eating, and we started manipulating it. We go from song and grunting into these more complex, resonant formulations. And those formulations have just gotten more and more complex, such that we can now journey backwards in time, forwards in time, into different dimensions of mathematics and what have you. So what we have to conclude is that process over? Have we kind of reached the end? Looking around, probably not. Shit's changing real fast in more ways than we can contend. We are not separate from that. We are in participation with that. The medium is the message. The mediums around us shape us. Our environments shape us. So I don't think that's a big point of contention. But an interesting question for me that's circling this is like the kind of ordinary person, so to speak. I think of like, close family members and so on who don't really take any interest in these kinds of conversations, but are subject to the forces of radical change that are happening in the world. The fragmentation of coherent reality, the radical increase in what Terence McKenna was kind of predicting 25 years ago, like the weirdness, the influx of weirdness, the influx of strangeness, combined with information warfare and psychological warfare on a scale and with a kind of magic capacity that has never before been possible. And folks, if you don't believe in magic, I'm looking at a screen made of lights,
Right.
and it's using this thing called electricity that was discovered like in the last couple of 100 years, and now like my voice is being shot through wires at the speed of light under the sea to Virginia so that we can have this conversation. So that's magic. And AI running information warfare is dark magic.
Yep.
And we are already being subjected to that kind of dark magic at an industrial scale. We already know that our own governments are using these tools against us and did so during the COVID years. The UK government did that. The American government, I believe, also probably did that. So there's something about the psychic resilience of the citizen that's also at stake here. It's not just a matter of evolution. It's like, how are you going to stay sane when the degree of fragmentation of what feels real is 2x, 3x, 4x, 5x what we're already experiencing? Mental health out the window, sense of coherent reality out the window. Well, it turns out sense making, consciousness, what it means to be human is to a significant degree governed by a shared field of reality, a shared story, a shared set of kind of values, maybe embedded in a myth, ritual, ways of participating. And so, yeah, I'm really feeling pretty dang confident that what we're doing is important. And it's also self-evidently important because it feels so meaningful. And conversations like this one, the ones that I've had with you over the past year, have been transformative. And they've afforded me to look at what is in a different way that changes what is.
Absolutely. I feel the same way. Evolution is always also the changing face of war. And so if you have an evolutionary change in consciousness and what incapable is doing, then that changes the battlefield. Raymond K. Hessel he does a lot of lovely work on psychological warfare, psychotechnologies, all these different things, and we have to take that very, very seriously. If you do not know the field, then you certainly can't win the field of battle. And a lot of people don't know the field, and so they concede the battle. And that's unfortunately occurring. And the issue is, you can say, well, there's not evil in the world trying to fight. The issue is, war tends to be a result of people with good intentions coming in conflict with the good. And you will never have a world that doesn't have good intentions. You see, the problem is a lot of people assume if you could give rise to a world that has no bad intention, then you'd be set. There'd be no war. There'd be utopia, basically. That's a little of a straw man, but there'd be, it'd be good. The problem is, the problems of the world usually are a result of conflicting good intentions and misinterpretations and bad and misunderstandings. That being the case, it is impossible to have a world that doesn't have the possibility of conflict. And also will not have a world, you'll never have a world where someone isn't trying to put force over someone else, because there will always be someone who has a good intention that's trying to bring about the good, and the force is thus it's not even force, it's help. And so taking all this very seriously is to also take seriously the fact that you will never have a world that's goodness gets it out of its fight. Because goodness is precisely what leads to fight, because goodness must always be mediated through an intention that might be wrong. And diversity is precisely the condition where the likelihood of goodness, just being good intention, coming in conflict with other good intentions is much, much more probable. Therefore, one has to psychologically develop to handle that reality. And what the world today is removing is the ability to believe that having good intention is enough. For most of history, you could plausibly deny that good intention wasn't goodness because you didn't have encounter with enough diversity and different ideas of the good to unveil that as a falsity. Now it is being forced to be unveiled as a falsity, which is an unveiling that the intention of an individual cannot constitute the good, because individuals are not all there is, relations are real as well. And so intention is always a reduction of a relation, because the relation is more primary than the intention. We see in Dialogos, do you intend the next thing you're going to say? Do you intend the whole thing out? No, it emerges in the relation. We put way too much emphasis on intention and good intentions, and we need good relation. That's an entirely different framing. And a world of which does not focus on good relation as opposed to good intention is one of which will be operating and organizing according to a data set that is not going to be able to organize it well. So we need to think in terms of good intention, a good relation instead of good intention, if there's going to be any hope that the field of battle is one that blossoms flowers instead of conflict. A few more things. If we do, in fact, make it to Mars, because there's a lot of people saying we need to go to Mars, that's the next frontier or whatever, that's just going to elongate the period of plausible deniability that the metaphysical is the realm we need to explore. Going to Mars, then, would not be a solution to our lack of a frontier. It would just extend the history, which was able to plausibly deny that the frontier it must confront is in fact this metaphysical with the MET in parentheses. And please note, every time I say that moving forward, we'll have the parentheses there. I'm not talking about classical metaphysics. Also, the gift of AI is that going to Mars would not make the human any less replaceable if it's purely a brain on a stick. Humans that go to Mars, if all humans are is rational animals as opposed to metaphysical beings, well, then you're useless on Mars just as much as you are on Earth once AI shows up. So that is just going to be moving the chairs on the Titanic. That is not a true frontier. That frontier is done. I'm not saying going to Mars is a waste of time, but it's not going to be one that brings about the fullness of time. It's also really interesting to me when you look back. I also want to note very, very quickly what you were saying on the technology and how it's kind of magic, how you use the internet. We have all been trained to think that if you know how the magic trick works, it's not a magic trick, right? So you pick a card, you put it in the deck, I make it vanish, magic. But then I show you how you do it and the magic's gone, right? The key is that the mechanism is the magic. Technology is the mechanism that, as the mechanism, is magical. We have a presupposition that if you know how the magic works, the magic is gone. No, reality is a place where nature and notion are combined. Therefore, the mechanism of the magic manifesting is magic. Mechanism and magic are two sides of the same coin because nature and notion are combined. Metaphysical and physical are two sides of the coin. We bring a presupposition of what we think. We believe that it cannot be magic unless you don't understand the mechanism. And also we have a bias for speed. It has to be instantaneous. It has to be like snap my fingers and it happens, right? No, the magic that is real has to follow physical laws, and you can understand the mechanism at different realms of consciousness. It's just that our bias of thinking that if you know the mechanism gets rid of the magic is false. We live in a world where understanding the mechanism is understanding the magic. And the separation of mechanism and magic is separating nature and notion. And as we've been describing, you cannot separate those or should not separate those. In Lacan, there's kind of this idea that the symbolic and imaginary registers are kind of used to mediate the real. If you handle the real all at once, it overwhelms you, and you undergo trauma, and it can destabilize you, and so on and so forth. And I actually have a lot to say on the landscape of trauma stuff, because I think, and maybe that's another conversation, because we should have 15 more of these. These are great. But the notion in Lacan is that no human being can handle the real too much, right? Well, what's interesting is I wonder if something similar applies to this idea of reality being metaphysical. Because indeed, that would be the real, right? If what we're saying is true, then the real is that the universe is metaphysical. And that's why it's natural to say it's woo-woo. It's natural to go, that's silly, or that's ridiculous, right? Because it's actually, if you think about it, kind of traumatic to find out that reality is metaphysical, because your entire structure of understanding reality is wrong. And I think Zupancha is correct that trauma has a lot to do with the inability to categorize experience. Something occurs and you cannot categorize it because it shows that your entire mechanism of understanding reality is false, right? So you've had to have thousands of years of humans developing to the place where they could gradually and slowly be introduced to the real of the metaphysical. That's why you have religions, because if you think about it, when religions talk about spirit and prayer, they're all talking about like metaphysical stuff, and some of it's like, okay, that's ridiculous, but that's not ridiculous. Oh, that's acceptable, that's not acceptable. And there's this gradual moving through, entertaining the possibility of the real of the metaphysical, but not so much that it seems crazy, gradually, slowly, like approaching Lacan's the real just enough, but not too much, then a little more, not too much. But now AI is going to force a confronting of the entirety of the real of the metaphysical. But since we've had thousands of years of gradually warming up to it, we might be able to handle it without being blown up, because we have enough. It's like you have that, you know, we mentioned remote viewing. There's that wonderful YouTube channel, The Theories of Everything, with that host. He's always talking with like people who are on the fringe. They're either like really advanced scientists, or they're talking about aliens, or they're talking about remote viewing. Isn't it fascinating that it seems like today people are more open to discussing stuff like that than ever before? Maybe it's a minority of a minority, but even if it's 5 million people, that's a huge increase, right? And even you have the aliens on the news, right? Now, I'm not trying to get into the alien subject, but what I'm getting at is that collective consciousness has gotten to the place where it seems more able to consider the possibility of these things. That right there is an emotional development that seems to be historically mediated, that required history to go to where consciousness could be more open to it. And as AI is a forcing function, the collective consciousness will get more open to it. And here's the thing. If nature and notion are linked, the more open consciousness is to it, the more it will unveil itself, the more it will unfold, right? But in order to be open to it, the collective consciousness, or what, you know, spirit or state, whatever Hegelian term you want to use, it has to do it emotionally. It has to go through an emotional process. But that means it has to be gradual by definition, because in Lacan, if you encounter the real all at once, it destroys you. In order to have it be difficult but not overly traumatic, right? It has to be just enough that it doesn't destroy you, but not so little that you don't go for it. It's actually exactly like Dante's model of God's hiddenness. You know, I've said it before, like in Dante, if God totally unveils himself, he destroys you because it's too much at once. But then if he doesn't unveil himself at all, you don't know he's there and you don't know how to seek him, right? The same applies to the very deepest truth of reality if it's metaphysical. It cannot unveil itself all at once because that would be overly traumatic and destroy people. So it has to do it gradually, where people can warm up to it, emotionally calibrate for more of it, and then come to the place where they're able to accept it when AI has the forcing function. right? And if you didn't have that process, humanity would not be emotionally trained to be able to handle what the forcing function brings about, right? So history may be a story of a gradual emotional calibration to the place where the collective consciousness can emotionally handle the metaphysical truth of reality, as AI will be a forcing function toward, of which Dialogos training and all these different things are evidence of that being the case. Because if you have all these conversations that disclose the existence of field, that would then make it plausible to believe that reality has a metaphysical function, ergo that AI will be a forcing function in that direction, ergo that history could be a gradual emotional warming up to accepting that possibility. And then on that, I think it's just also important to realize, like, whenever we talk about like dualism and all these, like, through history where spirit and matter are apart, there really has never been actually a school of thought that truly believed spirit and matter, metaphysical and physical, are totally separate. Maybe the Gnostics, but even the Gnostic, it's more like everything actually is spirit. It's more confusing than that. In Descartes, you know, Pei's been doing good work on this. Like, mind and body are not, they dual operate, like dual analogy stick. It's not that they're like separate, they're always in a dual, almost instead of dual, it's more almost like duel, like they're in a fight with one another. They're always relating in different things. So when you go through it, the point I'm getting at is when you go through history, there is a kind of a consensus that there's a relation between notion and nature, that there's some real relation between them, but we've been fumbling through the dark, trying to articulate it in different ways, in different fashions, and so on and so forth. Like you mentioned, and then I'll give it back to you, this idea that the human is a kind of bridge between these different worlds and so on. You have you have all these different models. You could get into the Hermetic tradition. We mentioned Gnosticism, Descartes with the brain, you know, Christianity, Hinduism, but all of them are different possible models for what could be the relation of nature and notion, and everyone's been trying to figure out. Oh, and by the way, the very existence of those models and the collective consciousness knowing those models are out there makes the collective consciousness more emotionally open to the possibility of there being some truth to something like that, as is necessary for the forcing function of AI not to be overly overwhelming, okay? So the thing is, what it would seem to be the case, and then I'll give it back to you, a way I would describe it, and it would be based on Hegel's phenomenology of the spirit before the section of reason, where he says the being of spirit is a bone. So, you know, people shorten that to spirit is a bone, which is pretty strange because he's saying spirit is a bone. I think a way to think about it is that all of reality is a Eucharist, the body of God, bread, at the same time equally in substance, right? Humans are also a Eucharist. The whole universe is a Eucharist. Humans are unique because we're able to refer to ourselves as a Eucharist. That's the move. We're equally part of the world, but we have the additional ability to recognize ourselves as equally part of the world. And I like that way of thinking about it because the reference does make humans special, but it also doesn't make them better than. You see, because that's always the trick, right? How do you say that humans are different from the animal kingdom, but at the same time don't act like they're better than other animals? Because that's kind of a speciesism kind of thing. Or how do you say that humans are like conscious and consciousness is not merely intelligence, but then at the same time not act like that entitles us to destroy the environment, right? That's always the tension in these metaphysical models. Well, if we think of humans as equally a Eucharist as the rest of the universe, basically, creation, but we're a Eucharist that can reference itself as a Eucharist, then we can only ever reference ourselves humbly. The only specialness that we have is the ability to see that we're not special, that we're part of everything else. And that to me gets into the Christ structure, because then God is the least is first and the first is last. And you see, and there's also a Eucharist, and that's why I privilege, you know, I tend to go in the direction of Christianity, is because that metaphysical structure is one that makes the unique characteristics of humans the ability to reference that they are like everything else. And so that's how you avoid pride. It's another way, it's the reason why I like this evolutionary model of consciousness too, is because I think it helps avoid some of the potential downfalls of, say, spiral dynamics. You know, a lot of people are worried, oh, if you're coral, you're better than other people. But you see, if your psychological changes are only thanks to a consciousness that requires an environment, well, then you don't have that change all by your own. You needed the environment, right? So now there's a humbling that occurred. There's an acknowledgement of difference and advancement, but also a humbling. That's what's always been so difficult. How can you genuinely acknowledge advancement and things are better than other things, while at the same time not saying that they're better than other things? Well, you can do that if you have a nature notion model. You can do that if you have a model that says everything is Eucharist and humans are different only in their ability to reference themselves differently as Eucharist, and all the other stages of like integral theory or spiral dynamics are simply shades of that ability that everyone has, right? So now we're getting difference in unity. We're getting harmony. We are saying that there are better conditions than others, but we're not saying those conditions entitle you to destroy the environment. They don't condition you to control other people. This is what we have to locate. And I think what we are describing can help in that direction while also addressing some of the issues of what are humans to do with AI.
I really, really love I think it's a very beautiful and elegant story that you are telling in relation to this AI horizon and what it means. And there's a beautiful kind of reciprocal feedback with this unknown future catalyst that you're engaged with. Each time you go back to it and it comes back, it's like, oh, this is how it exalts the artist. This is how it deepens the meaning. This is how it deepens the question of what it means to be human, and so on. And in the spirit of that nature notion, I wonder if you're actually, in so doing with others, creating a kind of portal. You know, almost like, you know, we have the field that we are here, but there's also a kind of imaginal field, and the stories that we tell can kind of create a portal through which we can move to. And when we're talking about metaphysical imaginal migrations, you know, it's almost just as meaningful as being like, hey guys, I'm pretty sure there's water over here, like there's a well over here.
Yes.
Somewhere with some pasture over here.
That's great.
It's as essential to our physical survival.
Yes.
At this point. Okay, and so this question of the relation between mind and matter, nature and notion, I think what I'm gleaning very, very recently that kind of brings a resolution to this for me, it was a very elegant fix for it. I'm reading Cynthia Bourgeau's book about basically synthesizing Gurdjieff and Teilhard de Chardin. In any case, what she's putting forward is that there are these levels going from spirit, consciousness, down to matter, and we can start to kind of creatively think as matter as a density of consciousness in some sense, rather than being something that's absolutely distinct from it. And I think the developments in our understanding of mind-body relation, in the understanding of how disease works, in the work of Gabriel Mate and so on, showing us more and more the content of our consciousness radically informs matter.
Yes.
If you think in a certain way, you can actually induce the death of the body.
Yes.
You can induce cancer in the body. You can induce disease through the quality of thought, through the trauma of the mind. And so the inverse then becomes possible, right? It means that if you are thinking in a more, if the quality of mind is more whole and less filled with dis-ease and friction, then that actually does have a downward effect on the body. And so what Viveki puts forward in After Socrates and his kind of big model of like reality is in some sense dialectic to Dialogos, is this upwards downwards flows. And this is a really helpful way to imagine it, is like consciousness, matter, and there's an upward downward flow, and we're kind of the bridge in the middle between the two. And I'm going to leave it there.
Yeah, I think what you're pointing at there, I really like what you're saying about there's water over here, and that being like a survival sort of thing. At the end of his poetry collection, Philippe Nicholas has this line. It's a beautiful collection of poems. He says something like, in the past, we had to survive to live well, but today we must live well to survive. And I think there's so much truth to that. In the past, we had to be physical to consider the metaphysical. But today we have to be metaphysical if we're even going to keep the physical, because otherwise it's going to be destroyed in an environmental crisis, AI or something like that. So I think we have to think there's a period of time now where there's a shift that has to be occurred, not because we've advanced to the problem is the language of higher. When you start saying higher consciousness. Well, yes, but you could have never gotten here if there wasn't the consciousness that was more blue than coral, right? And I know they're trying to describe that, but you can't get to a consciousness that can really take seriously the metaphysical unless you first go through a consciousness that takes care of the physical. The best way I've seen this described, which I have a huge bias toward, is Dante. Because what Dante will show you in the Paradiso, there's kind of this question of how can there be levels of heaven without that being torture? Like if you're on a lower level of heaven because, you know, you're not Mary Magdalene or something, doesn't that like cause it to be hell because you know you're not as good as you could have been, right? Like how does that, isn't that going to like how can heaven be heaven and have levels is the question that Dante is asking, right? Well, you ascend up a ladder, the experience of it is a ladder. But then when you get at the top and you look down, it's actually a circle where all the levels are equal. They're on the same plane, right? So from God's perspective, it's all equal. And you see the people on different levels are on that level relating to God. So they experience the level they're on as all equal in its right ordered place, right? So every single person on every level of the heavenly hierarchy views that hierarchy from God's perspective. And below him, it's all a circle on equal levels. It's all actually a movement of a dance. And you can't have a dance unless you have people on the outside doing their role. Inside, everyone's in the place they need to be to make the whole of the dance, right? And so the way Dante deals with this problem of hierarchy versus, you know, feeling yourself in a hierarchy is one, basically the hierarchy is a ladder and you can't get to the top of the ladder unless you have the lower rungs. And then from the top of the ladder, it's all a single point. It's all together. Right? And so likewise, that seems to be what's going on here with consciousness. There is a sense in which it's true that, say, coral is better than blue, right? Of course it has to be, because it's less prone to fall into totalitarianism if I'm getting the colors right. But then there's no coral without the ladder, right? Here's the issue. It's only bad to be coral in a world where you need blue, and it's bad to be blue in a world where you need coral. Oh, and by the way, sometimes the blue people are able to take care of the community better than the coral people. So it's all conditional. That's the key. Once you introduce condition to this whole equation, then you have to be actively thinking what's fitting. Now you have a language of fittingness, like we talked about in the Wrestling with Christianity talk. So you have to have that language to help you avoid the Messiah complex, right? Because a green person is not very useful when I have other tasks that I need to do, right? So the issue is like green is what, if green is the ability to handle paradox, that in terms of politics is extremely important to avoid totalitarianism. But when it comes to helping New Orleans recover from Katrina, blue is more important, right? So it's all situational. And now you have Dante's dance, where everyone has different roles in different places, but the whole movement of the suns and stars according to love, from God's perspective, requires the whole. So this is how you start having difference and better versus worse, but not having hierarchy, because you're bringing nature and notion in a manner that can help those things. You get trapped in hierarchical thinking when it's notion to notion. When you think of levels of consciousness compared to other levels of consciousness, not different consciousnesses embedded in different physical contexts that have different uses based on the fittingness. It's when you compare nature just to nature that you view evolutionary as advancing. Well, if you are in the frickin' jungle, it's better to be a lion than a human, right? But if you're in a city, it's better to be a human than a lion, right? So the problem is when we think of nature to nature, evolution looks like a hierarchy, right? But when you think of nature and notion, evolution is only advantageous relative to its environment, and some evolutions are better in other environments than not. So it goes with consciousness. And now we start breaking apart all the concerns of hierarchical thinking and so on and so forth, because we have a more Dante-esque model that we have to take seriously. Now, if nature and notion in fact inform one another, then the very thinking according to that model that was just posited would change how nature unfolds according to notion. And it would change notion according to nature, because now you can turn and reference that model, right? And you can operate according to it. And I think that's what we're seeing. As you posit the model and model enters notion, then it can experience nature, ergo AI, not as a terror, but a blessing, because this is the forcing function that's going to let us concern ourselves with the metaphysical. If AI is going to do all of your emails for you, all these different things, then you can just focus on Dialogos. You can just focus on freaking metaphysical. But if you identify the human as only that in intelligence of which the AI can do better, then the end of humanity is at hand. But the only humanity that's at hand in its end is one that is autonomously physical. But the end of the possibility of the autonomously physical human, if you grant me that language, is precisely the moment that forces the realization of man as metaphysical. And so the negation is a sublation, following Hegel. The failure is a realization of a success. The other model that helps overcome the arrogance of hierarchy is, in fact, the phenomenology of spirit, because at absolute knowing, you realize that you always already had all the levels. The movement of thought from consciousness to self-consciousness to reason is not evolutionary. It's just a realization because you already had all of them, right? So likewise, if you come to realize that humans are metaphysical, you don't have something that makes you better than other people. You have something you always already had that everyone already have. You just have a realization of it. And in fact, what happens is you're not better than other people. You now have a commission. You now have a call to spread the gospel, per se. You now have a mission to bring it to people's attention that they are actually metaphysical as well. And telling them that is not enough. You must give them the experience of it. So now it becomes it becomes part of your life. You know, you are obligated in a sense. You are driven with a mission to create the conditions and the environments where people can experience the metaphysical for themselves, which is the water. Hey, there's water over here that then gives them what they need to survive or to handle the forcing function of AI, not as apocalyptic, but an opportunity to realize what was always already the case, but we were not at a place to handle it. But we are now, given that people do the work of creating the conditions to realize it.
Wow. Beautiful. Beautifully put. My goodness. Okay, this is really, really clarifying. And I know I said 2 hours, but actually we're just going to go until it feels right, because that's the right thing to do.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so metaphysical beings, but physical beings, human beings in human bodies. It's my belief and experience that it's possible that we go higher into the metaphysical, and that at a certain point, whatever parts of the physical, or we could say lower stack, animalistic aspects that are not integrated, those things are going to come online. Whether you want to consider that just, you know, development that hasn't happened yet, or a trauma that's kind of blocking those things, in any case, the expansion of the consciousness of the field eventually brings those things to the fore. And I believe those things are really, really important. I believe it's a growth kind of upwards and downwards in both directions. For me, that downwards movement is into the animal. It's into the aspects. You know, I had this there's this game A, game B paradigm. People were like, you know, we just need to flip from game A to game B. We need to move to game A. We need to stop playing game B and not playing game A kind of thing. But actually, it's more like game A inside of game B, or something like that.
Yes.
And if we go into these new communities and contexts to play game B, and we're not fully rooted in game A, then game A happens in these nefarious ways. Exactly. And this basically accounts for all of the fuckery and traumatizing stuff that happens in cults.
Exactly.
Because you have the spiritual layer and people are brought up into it, but they're not deeply conscious and rooted in the animal layer and the animal dynamics. So actually there's a security, there is a energy, there's an eros, there's a lot of good shit that comes out of that. And that's part of my discovery right now, and part of our intention for this dialogue was, how do we sublate those energies, right? Because there's a lot of power in those, and it makes us more concretely here. And this is going to be part of the capacity to transmit the signal, not just, you know, creating these experiences, these ontological initiations, whether it's a conversation, whether it's with plant medicine, whether it's with cannabis, or whether it's the transmission itself, whether it's you doing your art, whether it's the art of expressing ideas. How you do that, the animal part is like giving the undertones, it's giving the bass to the rhythm of that. And bass just speaks to us in a way that, like, hi-hats and other notes, like, those are great, but we need bass underneath. And the bass is the animal part. It's the sense of like stake, participation, will, desire, energy, so on. So I'm really glad that we got to this piece. I want to take it now and slide it a little to the side and bring in another piece that was coming up for me as you were speaking, a little bit more to the landscape of psychological emergency that we are in and deepening into. I would say, we've talked about a lot of this as if it's like, what's the kind of 5-year horizon? But really what we're talking about is like an expansion of what's already happened.
Yes, this is key.
I think it's unarguable what we see with COVID, which is a kind of information warfare event as much as it was anything physical, if not more, is that is actually drawing up all of the stuff. It's been an apocalypse and a revealing of all of the shit that was not revealed when we were in this kind of able to stay in this like trauma maintaining grind of normalcy. The disruption brings it to the surface. Therefore, with escalating disruption, more of the things that need to be worked out are going to be brought out. It's just going to be shaken up. It's a psychic catalyst. It's drawing things from the unconscious up to the surface. And so we need shamans, a lot of them, a fuck ton of them. And luckily it's not something we have to do. It's also a kind of happening that is occurring. And many people are hearing a call, and perhaps we don't need to think of it just as kind of a special class, but more a spectrum, and that different people are called to different degrees at different moments or whatever stage they are, that in engaging in the healing, in engaging in creating a more sovereign life, they increase their overall capacity to attend, to care, to listen, and to love. And there's a sense in which there's almost like, and this kind of comes through for me often, if I have a mystical experience, if I have like a deep heart opening experience, which I had a few days ago, it was incredible. There's a recognition that in some sense it's been about love all along. And the scene, the context has changed radically beyond belief. We're in this psychedelic trip of time from where we were to this cybernetic AI future. But again, there is that, like, we're all together in a journey, going from one place to another, from birth to death, and our ultimate mission and purpose in some sense is to create a field, a net of love to hold one another through that journey, through this realm. And so it in that sense is very simple, spiritually speaking. All of that then becomes particular and interesting when we get into the fields and sovereignty and coherence and healing and sense making and community and the rigor of philosophy and so on. But this is a really important underlying dynamic of ultimately what we're called to do, and what I feel called to do in the future as we go through this very challenging trip. And people are going to go through really hard times. People are going to be having bad trips at many stages. And it's not so much that we're going to be delivering people from a state of asleepness to a state of awakeness, but rather we'll be initiating people into the process of ongoing change, which is unending. And so it's more like we're going from a artificial stasis of pretend normalcy that's resting on a foundation that's actually giving way and chaotic, at a structural level, at a societal level, but also individually, resting on childhood trauma, multi-generational trauma, trauma of war, all of these different things, parasitic, pathological habits of mind, self-harm, addiction, so on. And you're initiating the process of change, initiating the process of moving with the processes of healing and integration, which are kind of like an ongoing, never-ending journey that makes us a little more fluid, capable of then being of service to the larger whole, and then through participating in the whole as well, that feeds back on our own process. And that's sort of how I'm seeing the mission.
That's beautiful. If indeed consciousness somehow has a collective function, then it is possible that there is a collective placebo effect. And placebo effect is usually viewed as silly and dumb, but I think Michael Levin, he was stressing that we actually should make the placebo effect the center of medical thinking, not an outlier. Because if his xenobot experiments are correct, and in fact you see things self-organizing themselves according to a form, or like the laws of nature that don't seem to be anywhere and yet it still follows it, then that would all for him suggest something like Platonic forms. But it would also suggest, vertical causation of Wolfgang Smith. And for him, there would be reason to think that the placebo effect is some sort of effect that is in line with his work of with Mr. Levin and all that Levin is talking about with xenobots and so on and so forth. Well, could it be that there's also whatever placebo effect is, which maybe it's just conscious healing. It's difficult to use language like placebo effect because that brings with it all the connotations that come with it as anomaly, outlier, or whatever. But if we use the phrase, it is conceivable that history has its own placebo and its collective consciousness has its own placebo, and engaging in these practices then can collectively actually help heal trauma because collectively it thinks that it can and thus does, right? So it is possible, as there is individual placebo effects, there may be collective consciousness placebo effects, which I think then history could have a placebo effect, right? Which then is not a outlier where medicine always works. And then every now and then there's this weird thing called the placebo effect. No, medicine works because it's nature and notion. So the nature of medicine can affect the notion of health, but also notion can heal nature, right? So notion, the thought that you're better then changes your physical body to make you better. That's what happens in the placebo effect, right? So it's both. Yeah. Basically, also we should note that everything we're describing is some kind of dialectical monism. It's all a single substance, but it's a dialectical substance in of itself. It's not two substances that are dialectical like nature and notion. It's that whatever the universe is nature/notion. That is a single substance that is a dialectic. Yeah. That's the category that we are describing that Hegel's getting at. I've heard Bard use pan-dialecticism. I think he's getting at that. There's some other things here. But basically what we're describing is a metaphysical category that seems to be something like dialectical monism, which the closest thing I can think of that, which might be my own bias, is the Trinity. Because the Trinity is three persons, one essence. We're basically saying all of reality is multiplicity with a single essence, but the multiplicity is not reducible to the essence. You cannot. So there you go. So to me, if you were Christian, the fact that the universe has a dialectical monism would follow from believing it's made in the image and likeness of a God of whom is Trinity, and thus also in his very divinity has that sort of structure. So that's interesting in my opinion. What you were talking about, the shaman, that's exactly right. We're going to need more shaman than ever before. But what we will find is a very similar problem that has emerged in Christianity, which if you're a saint and know you're a saint, you become a sinner. So if you're a shaman and think about the fact you're a shaman, you become an egotist guru that creates all these wisdom cults. That one of the new abilities you've got, one of the abilities that a lot of religions as psychotechnologies taught that you have to have is to know something and be able to forget it. Know something and forget it. Know something and act like you don't know it. That is a crazy paradoxical ability, but it makes sense that you need paradoxical abilities if reality is dialectically monistic, right? So the saint has to know that sainthood is possible, otherwise they wouldn't try. But then they also have to know that if they're consciously aware that they're a saint, they take pride in it. So how do you do the double move? A lot of the people online who are talking about shamanism are exactly right, but they have to add to that the fact you have to act like you're not a shaman. And that's really, really hard. This is actually the big challenge, because you were talking about game A and game B. I think you're exactly right. You have to make game A give rise to a game B result. But that means you have to condition the subjects in game A to use the dynamics that are rivalrous to not be rivalrous, but competitive, that then is emergent. Like, the problem with posing game B as separate from game A is, what are we saying? Are you saying you're going to have different mechanisms of social operation? Well, that just sounds like a different good intention. And if it's a good intention as opposed to a good relation, that's not going to do much. And what I mean by that is that the mechanisms of game A all emergently arose to handle difference, to handle people wanting things that there's limited results. You're not getting rid of those mechanisms because they work. What you can change is how people relate to those mechanisms and use those mechanisms. You change the pricing mechanism from being about the distribution of limited resources to making the pricing mechanism about the optimizations with the relations that grow limited resources and grow limits. So what you have to do is, right now, the entire economic model is based on the limit of growth, right? And Cadell's made this point. What you have to do is use those mechanisms and change them to the growth of limits, right? You don't do that by leaving game A. You do that by taking the mechanisms of game A and identifying them as real relations, thus incorporating them into yourself as a subject and your subjectivity as transforming them, and thus change how you use them to give you a game B result. Because right now, we don't identify with our mechanisms. So if our corporations are destroying the environment, that doesn't mean we're destroying the environment. Our mechanisms are. Wait a minute, if relations are real, those mechanisms are just as real as your individuality, so you're destroying the environment. Suddenly, you have a different subjective mediation of your mechanisms. Thus, you start saying, well, how do I use these mechanisms to create value? And guess what value becomes now? Value becomes about being fully human and about creating relations as opposed to making money, because the mechanism is a relation. So the product of the relation must be what you are, and that is human. And you cannot reduce the human to a rational animal that just wants money. So what you have to do is identify with the mechanisms of game A, make them real, which thus changes what you use them for. And what you're using them for is to create the value of the metaphysical, the fully real, the fully human, as opposed to replacing the tree with lumber, to use Heideggerian language, to replace the environment with economic gains. Right now, game A mechanisms are being used for replacement as opposed to realization. The very mechanisms of game A can absolutely be used to realize reality as metaphysical, as opposed to replace reality with a notion that it's merely physical. The name of the game is not to escape game A, but to identify with the mechanisms to turn them into real relations, thus making the result game B. And that only comes, though, by a realization that the universe is metaphysical as opposed to split. So you change the subject, thus change the conceptual mediation of the subject, just change how the subject uses the mechanism, and you get your game B from game A. But that requires a change in the thinking of the subject. And here's why I think that is very, very important. So you have a lot of people right now, Greg Henriquez, the Utah, Vervaeke, the Elegant of the Reality. A lot of people have convincingly put forth models that are anti-reductionist science, right? There is very, very good reason to believe that reality is not reductionist now because of these scientific models, right? It is very important to believe that nature is not reductionist, because if you come to believe that humans are metaphysical, but in the end it's all heat death, who cares, right? So you need to believe that nature is not reductionist, right? And also, if nature is not reductionist, it's hard to believe that it would be metaphysical, right? But here's the thing. In Christianity, there's always a tension that having a good theology does not make you a good Christian, right? You can have the most true model of Christianity out there and be a dick, right? Not be a nice person, right? But then there's also the problem where the simple saint who has no theology then gets taken advantage of or falls into heresy, right? So you've always had to do both. You've always had to do the work of theology, ergo the creating of the emergent model like Utah and all of that. But you also have to conceptually mediate the subject, to use a Hegelian term. You also have to do the work of actually sitting with the poor, actually being there for the downtrodden, actually going into death, not ignoring it, right? Right now, a way to look at this is that as there were people doing the work of nature to see it as non-reductionist, thus opening it to the possibility of the metaphysical, there also has to be people doing work to conceptually mediate that opening of the subject to the metaphysical by, say, Dialogos process, by doing the Lacanian real, by doing the work of trauma, by doing the work of going into family. Because if you get the nature notion that's going to address the meaning crisis, but you do not conceptually mediate the subject, it will not matter. And I can say that confidently because it never mattered in Christianity. It never mattered to have the right theology if you didn't also have the work of really, really identifying with the suffering servant of Jesus. But then if you really, really identify with the suffering servant of Jesus, but you're still operating in a universe that's going to face a cold heat death, then what's the point? And God doesn't exist anyway because the universe is going to fall into a heat death. So why? So you always have to have both. So online, we have people who have given us the non-reductionist models of the universe. The Dialogos stuff is a practice that makes sense in a non-reductionist universe, but is doing something different than theory. It is the practice that helps you open up in the realm of notion so that you can be a subject that then can see themselves in that non-reductionist universe, ergo Eucharist universe, ergo see and have the emotional ability to reference yourself meaningfully as part of that universe. It does not matter if you say, I believe in Christianity if you don't identify with Christ. It does not matter if you identify with a non-reductionist universe if you can't identify with the non-reductionist universe. That is the bothness. You must have both. Hegel really emphasizes the conceptual mediation of the subject, the embedding back into common life that I like to do as Hume. That's the part of the equation that must also come into this so that the non-reductionist work on, like you talk and Vervaeke stuff, come together to actually give you the fully God and the fully man pure say, to have the Christ likeness, the hypostasis, right? The realization of the monistic dialectic that has nature and notion going together, and it not merely be an idea, but a reality you feel, but it will by definition be traumatic. Because you've grown up your entire life being told the universe is not nature notion. You yourself have been able to think that you can separate what you think from what you are. I'm now telling you that what you think changes who you are. You must change your life. If reality is in fact a place that is metaphysical, you must change your life. If the universe is in fact a place that is gaining in complexity and emerging into things that we do not know, you must change your life. You have to change so much, do you not? That's traumatic, but here's the key. The only way to get to the Paradiso is to go through the Inferno and the Purgatorio. You have to have the purgatory to get hell into heaven. You have to go through the suffering of the cross to have the resurrection. Hell is heaven without the purgatory. Heaven is hell with the purgatory, right? Because you go through the conceptual mediation and then you end up with Beatrice, right? So the problem that the online communities will now have, because we all have this problem, is because we're not open to the metaphysical. We are actually still practically separating nature and notion. What I mean by that is if you have emergent theory where you say that the subject is part of the universe, but you're not feeling it, you're not doing the experiences of working your libidinal economy, Lacan, psychoanalytic relationships, working on yourself, going through the purgatory, yeah, you have the right notion, but Hegel would say it's still one-sided. So it cannot be sublating. You have to have both, and you have to see both. You have to have the right theology as you take care of the poor. Not take care of the poor instead of theology, not do theology instead of the poor. The right theology comes out in the taking care of the poor. The right way to think about Jesus comes out in being like Jesus, and it can come out no other way. An idea that cannot be concrete is hardly even an idea, and an idea you cannot live was not alive. And so the name of the game is to take these sort of experiences and practices and all these things that we've seen throughout history, and that then give us the reason to think that if we were to live in sort of a manner that took that seriously, that would transform ourselves in the universe to be the conceptual mediation of that notion so that the people around us would see that horizon and believe it was a horizon worth pursuing themselves. And in doing all of that, when the AI has the forcing function of making us look for alternatives, there will be an alternative. I really like this idea that COVID was almost like a pre-forcing function. It's almost like there was a pre-forcing function to get us to the place where we could handle the more extreme forcing function of the AI. You needed the pre-forcing function to get the ball rolling so that you have a chance for the more extreme forcing function of the AI. right? Well, this puts us in that intermediate space. And in Hegel, the future is contingent. There is no guarantee of what will come next. What will come next is up to what we do now. And if indeed this is some sort of intermediate period, which I think you described very well, then it is very, very important that we take the now seriously and do what we can today.
Yeah, okay. I really, really appreciate how you're drawing down Dialogos in this way. It's becoming more and more clear the necessity and the nature of what this is and how it relates to the nature/notion way of participating in experience. And it's really key. It's a participation. It's a communion. It's not a discussion. It's moved beyond discussion because we're not just talking about the thing. We are enmeshed with the thing as it's happening. So to put it as simply as we can, it's like, unless there's a felt sense that the thing is happening here between us, then we may be off track. And that does not mean that there isn't space for discussion, for seminar-style dialogue in which we go into a particular area or topic. However, as a matter of hygiene in this liminal space, I believe most dialogues need to be more integrative in nature themselves. So we're not talking about content in isolation from the rest of reality. We're talking about content. We're doing the work with it. But as we're doing it, we're each conceptually aiding one another in understanding how that is deeply integrated with our direct experience outside of that dialogue. It doesn't need to be that way. But if you're going to have your seminar over here, you need to also have a men's group where you're going through how all of that fits in with your own reality and experience. Otherwise, spiritual bypass, philosophical bypass, whatever you want to call it, effectively, it's inviting of delusion. Because we can talk and talk and talk, and we can learn a language game, and we can be really good at it. But how do I know that that's actually flowing out into your own experience? And how do I know that your own experience is flowing back into it?
That's right.
And that's really dang important. Okay.
That's right.
So I want to play around this idea of the change being traumatic, from the non-metaphysical to the metaphysical world, to like the opening to mystery, which happens, because I don't feel that the opening for me has been traumatic. If we take traumatic to mean something which gives rise to disconnection from self. Right. It is actually going in the precise opposite direction. It's a reconnection with self. And by that, I mean both self in the sense of like, we're in a non-dual participation with the world. So actually our sensing of like, oh, actually, I'm not this totally separate thing from my phenomenological experience, but also the thing that is affording of that degree of participation with what's outside of you is a deeper participation of what's inside of you. Right. And so when you go through an LSD trip, mushroom experience, whatever kind of conversation that is ontologically transformative, usually part of that is a kind of awkward period of going within oneself and then like feeling something that's like, oh, I haven't fully felt this thing. And then that thing is fully felt and it comes in. Yes, it is through the reconnection with parts of self that the experience of reconnection with this transjective space outside of ourselves occurs. And so perhaps my reframe of it would be that it's not necessarily traumatic, but it might give rise to a confrontation with the trauma that's already there. It's actually like bringing the disconnection to the fore. And usually that's going to happen in this way that I described right at the beginning of the dialogue, it's not going to be that you're going to get the concept of what was disconnected and then it's going to be healed. It's going to be like, oh shit, something's happening in my body. Something's moving, going to start crying or shaking or what have you. And then through that energetic release, okay, that, I'm now rooted in a part of myself that I was cut off from before. And as above, so below, as in, so out. Anytime we become more rooted inside of ourselves, we're becoming more readily rooted outside. And so this kind of brings it to that heart opening experience I had a few days ago. And an insight that I've been playing with and exploring is like, to what extent is the heart actually the heart of not just like, we think of like, okay, we have heart, mind, soul, so on. What if the heart is actually the heart of mind as well? What if the heart is heart of cognition? I had a tarot card reading some time ago, which had something very much like this. It was kind of a heart pentagram, and it connected in a very elegant geometric way with all the different spheres around it. And what was communicated to me in this reading by my friend Matthew Green was that effectively the shift in realization within the heart actually enables the entire matrix of thought and concept to be more elegantly reorganized. And that's kind of a deep insight of the heart, then like, oh, everything else around, everything in the conceptual layers can be reorganized. And so I think there's this possibility of both insight into the heart, then reformulating the conceptual landscape, and also this really important matter of like letting it all go and having it come back that you talked about with the shaman. This, I think, has also got to be true for the philosopher and for the theorist and so on, that we let go of the entire conceptual framework, come back into the liminality of direct experience in some way, and then from that place, we allow the thing to then re-emerge, and there's a kind of in-breath, out-breath, similar to the Dialogos, self-other. And through this thing, the thing can actually like grow more elegant over time, rather than if we're just like, I'm a fixed thing and I'm trying to like get it all pinned down and laid out in the most elegant way. And obviously there's great progress we made with that, but like letting it die, letting it come back, and letting it die, letting it come back. And imagining that the state of the heart somehow is adducive of that. This is actually the spirit that Dialogos reveals to me about the way that cognition functions in the context of flow states and so on. When I'm more connected with flow, when I'm more in my heart, my capacity to cognize aloud in this fluid way and make connections between things is afforded by my connection with myself, with you, and therefore with the shared field. And I'm not necessarily, I'm able to make new connections from that place. I'm able to be more coherent than I otherwise would. And so as we develop this capacity more by doing everything we've talked about in the last several hours, our capacity to deal with and elegantly design and formulate and die and reformulate that whole landscape is going to just grow and grow and grow. And we're already seeing like a kind of beautiful mind coming online simply through this kind of community of dialogue and podcasting that we're both, this conversation is inside of, it's part of that larger mind, that non-local emergence that's happening. So
absolutely. Well, a few things. First, I should note that I am not claiming that, say, Henriquez or Viveki would disagree that, say, Dialogos of these conversations are one of the ecology of practices that lead one to feel non-reductionist
models of the universe. I don't think they disagree with that, and I don't think they disagree that just the idea of an emergent universe is enough to overcome the meaning crisis. You also have to engage in practices that make it an emotional reality to you. the challenge, I think, which is the big challenge that leads me into Hume and Hegel and Lacan and all these different people, is you have to also bring practices into the realm of, say, sexuality, economics, marriage, and that's where people are most difficult. That's where it's most difficult to mediate people. It's one thing to talk about like meditation, and meditation is important, right? You know, I take long walks. I like walks. But meditation is a contained hermeneutic. You don't have to explain to other people what you're doing and have the possibility of them misunderstanding and getting upset with you. In a relationship, when you're married, you find yourself in situations of possibly being misunderstood, because like a Chekhov story or something like that. And also you find yourself having to make money that add pressures that make you not have time to meditate, right? So we have to think libidinal, like Cadell will say, the libidinal economy. We have to think economics. And the economics are, let me tell you the other advantage of that though. When you start talking about economics, it's really hard to have a cult. Like, because there's the hard reality of you got to make money that forces you to not think of yourself as being able to save the world and having all the answers. You may have some of the answers, but you can't have all the answers because you don't know how to sell a product. Like business, a lot of philosophers will be like, I'm bad at business. Well, right there, that kind of works against them being like a guru cult person, right? Because they have to admit they're bad at business or something. And there's actually something very good in that, because economics in of itself is an expression of nature notion. There is no economy. We think there's an economy. The dollar is a piece of paper. We think it's worth something, thus it is. The economy screams nature notion. The whole thing screams nature notion. And so by having to take it seriously, that also can make you attuned to not falling into cult dynamics, because to fall into a cult, it has to be one-sided. The moment there's two-sided, well, then you avoid that. And the reason I keep talking about cults is because at the Stoa, they had the wisdom commas versus what's the difference between a wisdom commons and a wisdom cult. I think it's a very good question. It's a difficult question. Religion and Christianity has dealt with, Christianity has dealt with that for a long time and not always figured it out. And I will also note that religions are an invaluable resource to these conversations. And I think it would be very beneficial if a lot of the people in the spheres would actually study church debates, church history, theology, and different things, because what you're actually seeing is a kind of recapitulation of those old ancient debates that have been going on a lot in new forms that we can actually think are new, because we have a tendency to think that whatever we're dealing with today is the first time humanity has had to deal with it, when really what you see is a collective consciousness always revisiting it until it's ready for the real of the metaphysical, right? Until it's reached the emotional adaptation. And now we're getting to that place where we have to, because of the AI forcing function. So I think when you have the two-sided, and the other thing is that sexuality inherently entails a nature notion, because if you say that sex is merely two bodies, you say, no, it's not. There's also some sort of love. And all efforts of people to make sex have nothing to do with love, have led to the meaning crisis, have contributed to nihilism, and have also led to like if you look at the rates of people having sex, no one's having sex anymore, basically, because it's boring or something, right? And so sex is also a wonderful example of where nature and notion are combined, right? Likewise, the economy, likewise, religion, likewise, philosophy. So the more and more the online conversation thinks those things, the more likely it is to actually be contributing to the realization of the metaphysical as opposed to a cult. And actually, if you deny these things, although you may not be a cult today, you will be heading in that direction, because you will by definition have to enclose yourself off from those realities to not think them, and now you're in a cult dynamic, you see? So I don't believe, where they're talking about, oh, these online groups are cults. Yeah, we see that in QAnon. Yes, we see that. But I, again, think there's I think there's actually kind of a anti-guru where you have all the answers because you're able to see the false guru and other people can't, so everyone should come to you. Also, I think it's easier to critique than create. So I think there's a social incentive to be the one worried about cults. So because you're like the one who sees the truth. So I think that needs to be taken into account, because it's really easy to say those people are forming a cult as you never build anything. Try building something. See how that goes for you. It's pretty hard. Oh, by the way, if you are creating the conditions for a culture, you also have the potential for a cult. There's no way to have a meaningful community that couldn't turn into a cult. Just because the variables are there that may make it a cult does not mean it is a cult. It all depends on the conceptual mediation of the subjects in those communities. Oh, wait, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the entire working the subjects to make sure that's not realized. And And eventually, though, the day will come where all of these current communities will have to decide if they take seriously economics and the libidinal and relations and all of that and think them. And if they close themselves off, then it will be as if they were always a cult. But if they actually address those things, then it will be as if they were always a community. This is what I call a flip moment. We are always in the business of a flip moment. And this is the trick with trauma that's very difficult. If you go through purgatory to get to heaven, purgatory is part of heaven, as if it was always part of heaven. But if you go through purgatory and don't make it to heaven, it's as if it was always part of hell, right? This is what's very tricky, and we need a more sophisticated language for trauma because we only have one term, and it means something like your experience was shattered and it was stage shattered, right? But there's also forms of different degrees of trauma. There's trauma as purgatory that then is the precondition for heaven. And then there's trauma as so great that you fall into hell, right? And what's interesting is that gets into kind of the anti-fragile, fragile, robust debate of a Nassim Taleb, right? And then the problem, though, with that is how do you describe trauma and not make a hierarchy? It's the same problem as earlier, right? Because we were like, if you say some people use trauma to build, you're kind of saying that those people are better than the people who went into trauma and didn't come out of it, right? Well, then you could say, well, the people who didn't come out of it had true trauma, and the people who didn't come out of it didn't have real trauma, and you get into that debate, which is all one-sided. It's not a useful conversation, right? What you end up happening also, that's why in Dante, just because someone is a saint does not necessarily mean they overcame more than someone who's not so much a saint, because maybe someone was born with a mental situation where just not kicking a kitten was the greatest act of kindness they were capable of. And since they didn't kick that kitten, they're actually just as great as Mother Teresa, right? So these are the things that you can't judge in that situation. But what you're seeing there is that whatever the trauma is for every single person, maybe someone is facing some sort of trauma from their family that makes getting up off of the couch the equivalent of the greatest acts of sainthood in human history because of the intensity of that trauma that another person did not have. Right? So you can't judge these different things, but what you see is actually, regardless the situation in a Christian construction, trauma is always the thing you respond to, because that is the thing of which determines who you are. And it's not the results of the trauma that determine how well you overcame the trauma. It's your own subjective mediation in light of that trauma that only you can know and that you can do because you're the only one who experienced that trauma. And that's where you take seriously the fact that your nature impacts your notion and your notion impacts your nature. And you right there are engaging seriously in the fact that your challenge is yourself. We really, really need to focus. For me, I focus a lot on the subject conceptually mediating themselves more though than systems building, not because I think systems building does not matter, but because I think the work of individually helping each individual handle their own traumatic experiences to the utmost that they are capable of which cannot be determined by the results of what comes out of the response to the trauma, but the development of the subject in light of that trauma that only they can know and only they can judge, giving that person the tools to handle that situation, and that ability is a really, really important part of the conversation, and in fact is the work of Notion to itself, so that when it learns it's not in a reductionist universe, it matters. You tell people that they're not in a reductionist universe, but they're not able to have a concept of their relation to trauma that makes it possible for them to be victorious. It does not matter. So you have to give them a model of thinking about what does it mean to rise to the occasion of your trauma that makes it matter that you're in a non-reductionist universe. And that's where you get into the work of the psychoanalytical. That's where you get into the Hegel. That's where you get into the Christian. That's where you get into all those different things. And that then is where every single individual is in their own step of that dance that you can only see from the top, that only God can see, that because there is a top from which you can see the entire movement of the sun and stars that move according to love, then you have faith to believe that when you are confronting your own individual trauma as best you can, it's part of something bigger than yourself, and it matters. If the best you can do after your trauma is get off of that couch, and that is the equivalent of the greatest acts of sainthood in human history relative to your condition as only God can know, then you getting off of that couch is an invaluable variable in the overall beautiful beatific vision and realization of collective consciousness through history so that it can know itself as metaphysical. So get off the couch, because that is an act of great sainthood for that person in that situation. And what we all need to do is, in our own individual circumstances, do the work of conceptual mediation so that we can face our own trauma the best we can, so that it can participate in that greater vision in the manner that the whole can realize itself as in the parts in the whole, and the dance of the beatific vision may dance in the manner that makes us able to handle the forcing function of AI. And then instead of AI being a curse, it becomes the purgatory that was always already part of heaven.
All right, there's a really nice kind of synthesis coming here, and you've done a lot of it. So maybe this will be kind of my closing chapter, or we can do the closing after, but I won't throw out too many more pieces. First and foremost, what you said about getting off the couch, I deeply resonate with that. I can remember distinctly a period in which going out for a walk from my apartment to the little cemetery with the trees 5 minutes away was the most healing thing that was going on. And boy, was it beatific. When I went for that walk and I looked at those trees and I broke out of mild dissociation into connection with mystery, that was fucking saintly for me and very, very powerful. So I completely resonate with that. I think, to be real, that the breakdowns and blow-ups are probably going to be part of the journey.
Yes.
And we should anticipate that. And I think my deepest takeaway from this is that Dialogos and the relational field that we're cultivating is absolutely essential, and it's also not the whole story and sufficient. There has to be another piece. For me, that piece looks something like Christ, because when the thing blows up, what is the dialogue that you engage in when you are with yourself, with the trauma, that actually makes the movement possible, that, as you say, has the faith that situates it in a larger context, that sees it as part of a greater happening? This is so deep. And I don't think Dialogos alone necessarily gets us there. So, and yet, I've directly experienced how massive relational breakdowns occurring where there's a foundation of Dialogos can be rebuilt by the mere fact that you've cultivated those damn skills.
Yes.
For a long time. And so, both the greatest blessings that have been bestowed upon my life's journey. The two of those things: relation to Christ, faith, what comes in that, and the access and experience of the transformative experience of Dialogos and everything that affords.
Absolutely. The challenge today, so a way to think it, where you need both and you need all of these things, is the seminary can never also be the food kitchen. And if it is, it's not very good at it. And the food kitchen can never be the seminary, or it's not very good at it. But it's really, really hard as a seminary to not also try to be a food pantry, because you don't want to admit to people you're not also a food pantry, because they're like, well, why don't you give the poor food? And there's like a confronting of the self and you feel inadequate. You know that your role is to teach theology, because if all the Christians are taking care of the poor, but they have the wrong theology, it's not going to matter. And you certainly check out the food pantry and help there, but your emphasis, your role is on teaching theology. Well, you have to be really, really comfortable and at home with the idea that your role is teaching theology, and you're not putting all the resources into being a food pantry because the people down the street do that. Well, now I'm vulnerable because the people down the street may not be doing that well. I'm also admitting that I can't do everything. And also I'm saying that this only works as a whole in relation. I, as a seminary, need to have a relation with a food pantry, that at my seminary I'm teaching that food pantry matters just as much as the seminary, all while I admit I'm not doing it as well as the food pantry. And if I try to compensate for that by then becoming a food pantry, I tend doing both poorly.
Well, this would mean that a seminary that was the greatest seminary on planet Earth, that taught the greatest theology of all time and was the most brilliant place on planet Earth, could never be the whole picture. It always must have a Gödel incompleteness theorem part of it. And how can you have a wisdom code in that situation? If the seminary must always acknowledge that it cannot be the full picture because it can never be the food pantry, that in of itself works against cults. And that in itself means that the seminary can only do the full mission of, say, Christianity in relation to the food pantry. And the food pantry has to do the other thing as well. So then the truth, the greatest truth, is the relation, which no single unit can fully capture for themselves, which works against the wisdom cult, right? The relation is the reality. For most of history, we've located our metric, the thing we're trying to make, as either a seminary or a food pantry. And for most of history, you could make that mistake and it not be consequential because of the limits of diversity. We talked about that earlier. Now, we must identify with the relation between all of the parts and see that as the most real. But that requires giving up control, because no one person can completely control the relationship without killing it. You see that in dating all the time. It also means you have to see yourself, even in your most expertise excellence, as lacking something. If you're the best theology professor in the world, that means you're not the best at a food pantry. So expertise brings with it lack. That's humbling. And you also have to trust in other people doing the best they can in their area, because if the food pantry isn't doing what it's supposed to do, then the Christian mission of the entire community is incomplete or failing, right? You got vulnerability, you've got relation, you got humility, you've got mechanisms to work against cults, and you have community, and you have a role for expertise and focus on, say, Dialogos or an emergent model or sexual relations or whatever that doesn't exclude the other. So you're trying, now you have hierarchy, but you also have the dance, right? Because there are some people better at teaching theology than others, but no matter how good the professor is at teaching theology, he will never be the expert food pantry person. Do you see? So you can have top of a hierarchy, but still the top of the hierarchy is humble, right? So you're bringing all these things together, and we locate the metric, the success, as the whole story of all of those parts doing their expertise. And that's what AI can never take from us. AI can never take that. They may get better at doing the seminary, but they will never ever take away a people that see themselves in the relation of all the parts. And those parts themselves making the relations create something real that AI cannot capture. In fact, we might be able to use AI to help it. You mentioned love. Heidegger has that really important stuff where he says that the structure of the human is care. Like yourself is structured by what you in your past care about, your birthday parties, your memories, your present you care about, and what you think about the future is what you care about. So care structures the subject, right? So the heart structures the mind, and mind structures the heart. You cannot separate them. That was Heidegger's construction of care. Now, what's interesting in Heidegger, though, is there's always a risk of care coming to be all that matters. And so Heidegger says you need to care, but also clear. You need care to clearing. And a clearing is where you structure yourself according to love and mind, but never ever think that your dialectical relationship between your heart and your mind is the only heart and mind. You get yourself out of the way, you clear aside so that the full being can come forth. You know, for Heidegger to get being, you have to clear, and that means clearing aside your egotism. That means clearing aside your individuality outside of relations. One of the ways to think about this, if Owen Barfield and all of them is correct, that there are only relations in this life, then that bookcase right there, and I was speaking with Trey on this and Emilio, that bookcase right there that gives that you experience as a bookcase, it's giving you itself as a gift as a bookcase so you can understand it. It's not given as a bookcase. Everything you experience are gifts. The idolatry is when you say that bookcase is a thing outside of relationships. Idolatry is belief in things instead of relations. Things are simply how relations gift themselves to you so you can understand them, because if you had to experience the whole room at once, you couldn't function, right? But the idolatry is when you start treating the bookcase as a thing, not a gift that relations present themselves as so you can understand them. Likewise, the idolatry is when we treat the seminary as only needing the seminary and not the food pantry. Idolatry is when you treat Christianity as just the seminary and not the relation between the seminary and the food pantry, right? The gift of Christianity is in the identification of deepest reality as the relation, not the things in relation. But you can't have relation without the things. And so the givens of things become gifts in the relation. And Christianity is a praising and glorification of those relations. Well, that's what all the online communities have to do. A praising and glorification of the relation between nature and notion, not just one or the other, but that requires the work of the subject, the work of building oneself up so that they can see what they are doing, even if that's just getting off of a chair, as contributing to the bigger picture of the development of nature and notion. That if we're not all doing, then, well, AI will just be a forcing function into a casket. And so we have to rise that to occasion. I think on that point, we can see why it seems to be that love is always what these philosophies lead to. Every religion seems to lead to love. God is love. Love is what matters. Every philosophy could be, what is love? Love, and, you know, I know we could do the song there, but you know, love seems to be a pure experience of notion nature. When you love someone, are they merely their body? No, they're also Sarah, right? So there's a notion on the body of Sarah, the nature notion. Love, what's funny enough, two couples that are married to one another, they start to look like one another through time, right? When they have a deep relationship, their bodies literally seem to kind of mimic one another. It's like the placebo effect. So right there, the relation changes the physical composition of the people in marriage, right? Almost as if nature and notion are two sides of the same coin, and notion and nature are side. Children become like their parents. They have similar habits. You can say it's all genetic, but it doesn't seem to be genetics because the activation of those habits seems to be contingent on the relationship between the parents and the children, right? So you see in love that nature and notion are bound together, right? That love is, in fact, the very unfolding of the relation of nature and notion, because notion allows the ability to care about something, so you put yourself in relation to it so you can be changed by it. When you say, I love you, Sarah, you are saying, Sarah, I will put myself in a world where I am around you, where what you do changes me, what happens to you changes me, and I back and forth. I am imagining that world, I am committing to that world, and I am thus putting myself in a world where my notion of who I am is forever part of the notion of who I think you are and who you think I am, and that will change us. That will determine where we live. That will determine what we have in 5 years. That will determine if we have kids or not. The very world you live in is completely shaped by that notion of love, which then has a commitment of the nature. And so in love, you see nature and notion profoundly shaping one another. And so when we start talking about structuring the subject according to care, and we start talking about nature and notion as being fundamental, then it would make sense that it would ultimately come down to love, and love being a commitment. So love, though that isn't a commitment, does not have a sustaining of the things in relation to have that transformation occur, right? So this is why you also see throughout history this kind of binding of love and commitment. It seems like when you say love, people are like, no, you didn't love them, you just liked them, right? You just enjoyed them. Love seems to have some sort of commitment to it, some sort of thrust, some sort of risk, some sort of, I am here, I am putting myself in it, and I am not going back. So love seems to require a commitment, and that is the commitment to put yourself in a place to have nature and notion change you in ways that you cannot predict ahead of time, because it cannot be known until you're in it to have the transformation occur. And so for all of this to happen that we have been describing, and for all of the realization of the metaphysical to unfold, that would perhaps turn AI into a blessing because it becomes a purgatory that was always part of heaven, it will require a commitment. So we have to decide if we're committed to this vision or not. And if we're not committed to it, we cannot be made new in love.
I think that's our close.
I've enjoyed it, Jacob.
I commend you. I see you for what you're doing, and it's astonishing, the energy, the rigor, the care, the fellowship. Sometimes I wonder if we're engaging in an invisible college or some sort of invisible ecclesial thing. I'm wondering, is this church in some way? I don't know. There's a blurring of all these things, but I really appreciate it.
I do as well. It will come out in the commitment, I believe, Jacob. The commitment will be the unfurling and unfolding of it. And it may just turn out to be, as I think it always already was, part of the love that moves the sun and stars. Been a pleasure, Jacob.